and welcome to Based on a True Story, the podcast that compares your favorite Hollywood movies with history. Today we're going to learn about the 1991 film called JFK. JFK, of course, stands for John Fitzgerald Kennedy, who was the 35th president of the United States. But the movie doesn't really talk much about Kennedy as a person, though. Instead, it deals with the events during and after November 22nd, 1963, when President Kennedy was assassinated in Dallas, Texas by Lee Harvey Oswald. Or was he? According to the main character in the movie, Kevin Costner's version of New Orleans District Attorney Jim Garrison, there might have been more of a conspiracy involved as he starts to uncover that it may not have been Oswald behind the assassination. Maybe Oswald was just the fall guy, and it was really the U.S. intelligence agencies who were behind assassinating their own president. More specifically, the movie suggests the CIA was involved because they didn't agree with JFK's policies. To help us separate fact from fiction in the movie, we'll be joined by Marty Morgan. Of course, Marty has been on Based on a True Story numerous times before to talk about mostly World War II movies and TV shows like Saving Private Ryan, Band of Brothers, or The Pacific. That last one, The Pacific, is just one of the many TV shows, films, or video games that Marty has worked on throughout his career. But today's episode started after the last time he came on the podcast to cover another World War II movie, The Thin Red Line. After we did that episode, Marty tossed out the idea of covering the movie JFK. And I'll admit that at first, I was a little surprised because it's obviously not a World War II movie. But you see, Marty lives in New Orleans, where a lot of the story from the JFK movie takes place. And he's also been fascinated with the true story. So he spent decades researching it. And if you've heard any of our other episodes with Marty, you'll know the amount of detail that he dives into. So I can't wait to chat with him about this movie because there are so many different layers to this story, and Marty is the perfect person to unravel all of that for us. Before we do that, though, there's just one thing we need to set up our game. 2 truths and a lie. Now, if you're new to the show, here's how it works. I'm going to give you 3 facts we're going to talk about during the episode. 2 of them are true, and 1 of them is a lie. Are you ready? Okay, here they are. Number 1, up and to the left proves there was another shooter. Number 2, it was possible for Oswald to have taken 3 shots in 5.6 seconds with a bolt-action rifle. Number 3, the U.S. Congress passed a law because of the movie JFK. Got him? Okay, now as you're listening to our story today, your challenge is to identify which one is the lie. And of course, we'll do a recap at the end of the episode to see how well you did. All right, now it's time to connect with Marty Morgan about the historical accuracy of JFK. I'm so excited to dive into this movie because I am a huge fan of conspiracies, and there are so many of them surrounding JFK's assassination. But before we dig into some of the details, we're still talking about a movie that can have its own creative license to things. So if you were to give 1991's JFK a letter grade for historical accuracy, what would it get?
F-. Final answer. Next question. And I'm not kidding. This movie gets absolute F- because of the purposeful way in which the actuality of the Kennedy assassination was deliberately misrepresented and distorted throughout the narrative of the film.
We'll dig into some of the details there, but I was curious about that because there's multiple layers to the movie because you have a movie, but then on top of it, there's a lot of questions as well. And so that's why I was curious about specifically about the accuracy of this one too, because how much creative license around something that there's already going to be a lot of creative license in the actual true story as well that a lot of people don't know as well.
Yeah. And like, I have to admit, of course, I watched it again for the millionth time in preparation for this chat with you. And I enjoyed it because it's a great movie. Because what is it combining? It's giving the American public a main course that's steak, mashed potatoes, and a beer. It's giving the American people like everything they just lust for. It's courtroom drama. It's solving a crime drama. It's high conspiracy, and there is no better director that could serve this up the way that Oliver Stone can. And I make this argument that Oliver Stone's restaurant serves one meal and one meal only, and it is conspiracy with a side of disillusionment. And I'm only partly being silly and dismissive when I say that. But Oliver Stone prepares things to a certain flavor. And there was a period in American history about 30 years ago when that's all everybody wanted. Everybody absolutely loved post-Vietnam era cynicism. They loved suspicion. They were absolutely enamored with and intoxicated by anything that provided them an occasion during which they can be suspicious of our government and what it's up to in ways that I believe complement our government beyond its actual needs. They imagine a government that's all knowing, all powerful, that's capable of pulling off something as absolutely outrageous as the assassination of the president and covering it up effectively. That's catnip. The American people couldn't get enough of it. The big question I kept asking myself when I watched the movie again over the weekend was, how would this play today? If this movie came out now, would it play? And my first thought was like, first of all, they would never make this movie now. And then secondly, if they did make it and it came out now, would it be the sensation that it was in 1991? So I remember watching it in the theater in 91 when it came out and being swept into it because it was as a result of this movie that I rushed out and bought the Warren Commission report and read all 888 pages of it. Hours of my life that I will not be getting back anytime soon. But it was because Oliver Stone, the master storyteller, and he's such an excellent storyteller within one specific genre of storytelling. That genre that wants to reach in and stimulate my senses of suspicion and disillusionment. These things that were common among almost everyone in that era that followed Vietnam. And we really weren't that far from Vietnam way back in 1991. It's so bizarre to think of it as having been so long ago, but it was. I was just finishing my undergraduate degree in history when this movie came out. It came out right in the middle of all of that, and I got swept along into it myself. It began this love affair with the JFK assassination that stays with me to this very day. It triggered me to do a lot of reading, and at this point, I've done so much reading about this assassination that there are times where I find myself, have you seen that meme that shows, oh God, what's his name? El Chapo. Is it El Chapo or it's one of the big South American drug lords. And he's sitting alone at a party looking sad and dejected. And I can't remember who it was, but I have done so much reading into it that from time to time, as a part of my journey, I will encounter someone else who is equally as interested and enthusiastic about JFK assassination. And we just snowball into this love affair of gushing about all the possibilities. And like, have you read this? Have you read that? Did you see this photo? Did you see that photo? And you're in trouble when it ends up with me going, hold on, I know right where the photo is. Flip. Here's the photo. It often turns into that. And where did all of that enthusiasm come from? I think it came from Oliver Stone. I remember what it was like before this movie. I remember because I had survived all the way through my high school, well into my adulthood, and I had finished college. And so I have this memory of what life was like before the movie JFK. And I now, of course, have 3 decades of looking back on what life has been like since the movie JFK. And that movie changed everything. This movie, it created a sensation, and we're still living in the shadow of this movie to this very day.
Well, you mentioned the timeline there. Of course, movie coming out in the 90s, but the movie starts by kind of setting up the situation in the 1960s. And according to the movie, after JFK narrowly wins the vote to become president, he inherits a secret war against the communist Castro dictatorship in Cuba. That war is run by the CIA and angry Cuban exiles, and it culminates with the disastrous Bay of Pigs invasion in April of 1961. And then as the movie explains it, Kennedy refused to provide air cover for the exiled Cuban brigade and publicly took responsibility for it. But then privately, he claimed the CIA lied to him and tried to get him to order an all-out invasion of Cuba. Then, in October of 1962, the world's on the brink of nuclear war. The Soviet Union has nuclear missiles in Cuba. Even more were on their way, but then they turn away. And then there's rumors that in Washington that Kennedy made some sort of a secret deal with the Russian premier, Khrushchev. And there are more details that the movie shares, but right away we kind of get this idea of there's a picture being painted by Oliver Stone there in the movie of an internal struggle for power inside the United States government between the intelligence services and the president. Is that a fair interpretation of what was going on inside the U.S. government in the 1960s?
Yes. And it's fair, I think, also to offer the evaluation that administrations were struggling to deal with the spiraling costs and the spiraling effects of the Cold War. And that the Kennedy administration came into office with a bit of a different philosophy. And that philosophy, well, I should say that the verdict of history has not really been all that friendly toward the Kennedy administration's change of philosophy. And that philosophical change was oriented more toward engagement than confrontationalism. And looking back, it's, I think, a little bit of a fool's errand to go, well, was that the right thing to do or was that the wrong thing to do? I think all that actually matters for purposes of this conversation is that the administration's interest and engagement would not have been served by providing direct air support for an American-led invasion of Cuba. Full disclosure, I'm speaking to you from Tangipahoa Parish, Louisiana, where many of those people trained before and they went to the Bay of Pigs because I live in the area around New Orleans. And so much of that story and the JFK assassination story are centered around events that unfold right here where I'm sitting talking to you now. But the administration recognized that if I provide this air support, it will represent an escalation of the tensions between the United States and the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics. And the administration chose not to follow that confrontationalist path, choosing instead an attempt to allow these hostilities to settle through the process of engagement. And in fact, the Kennedy years would see stepping back from some of the hostilities that had characterized the early Truman era of the development of the Cold War, and then certainly the Eisenhower years of the Cold War. What we would see under President Kennedy would be a reluctance to hurl ourselves into a full commitment in the Republic of Vietnam. We would see engagement along the lines of what would eventually be realized in the form of the Limited Test Ban Treaty in 1962, which would be the ban on atmospheric nuclear testing, which the world, I think, agrees to this very day was a step in the right direction in terms of de-escalation of Cold War tensions and nuclear tensions. Then, of course, with the missile crisis, what we see is that is not so much the perfect example of a president standing firm and staring them down and making them blink, which is how it was sold to me when I was young. It's not so much that as it is a presidential administration that's rewarded by back channel engagement, an administration that is through a back channel working with this opponent toward a negotiated settlement of a harsh, potentially harsh confrontation, because President Kennedy only de-escalated the missile crisis by agreeing to allow the removal of some of the American Jupiter ballistic missiles from bases in Turkey. And that was done as in exchange with the Soviet Union. And their part of that exchange agreement was they would remove the intermediate range ballistic missiles from Cuba. This is not the type of Cold War confrontationalism that we have been seeing previously. And the administration wanted to bring more engagement to the table. If he had sent bombers in to support the invasion at the Bay of Pigs, that would not have served his objective of engagement. It would have escalated things at a time when I think we can all agree now, looking back to that era, that escalation did not serve anyone's interests at all. And that the era that we entered, which was the era of at least a limited engagement with the Soviet Union, that was an era that rewarded us all. Because after all, what was the option for the missile crisis? Was that option an American-led invasion of Cuba? That would have been a catastrophe. Was the option a tactical nuclear strike against ballistic missile sites in Cuba? That would have led to a general nuclear exchange, something that we can all agree would not have served anyone's interests at all. And so it was a matter of, what do we do? Do we keep holding the line and staring down the dirty red commie bastards, or do we engage and attempt to negotiate our way through these sticking points? The administration wanted to engage, and this was a country that was stockpiled about 50% with people that wanted to stare down the red peril, and the other half interested in such ideas as engagement. So the people that wanted to stare him down did not vote for John Kennedy, and John Kennedy was carried into office. And so there were a lot of people, particularly in the South, that didn't care for him and didn't care for this idea of being easy against the communists. He was perceived as being easy against the declared communist enemy, which was not a good way of being portrayed to the American public circa 1961, 62. And that's why he had so much opposition around the country. And that's why he went on a trip to Dallas and Fort Worth. It was election season. He wanted to develop some goodwill. He wanted to remind the people that he was there for them. He wanted to go to a place that was not known for being Kennedy friendly. And look what happened.
Well, you mentioned New Orleans, and the main character in the movie, Kevin Costner's version of Jim Garrison, is the district attorney in New Orleans. And according to the movie, the reason why he's investigating the assassination of President Kennedy that you mentioned there happened in Dallas. Early in the movie, it explains that Garrison got involved because Lee Harvey Oswald spent the summer in New Orleans before the assassination. Was that really how Jim Garrison got involved with JFK's assassination then?
No. Next question. I mean, I'll quit being silly, but that is a fundamental distortion of the reality of the way that District Attorney Garrison would ultimately open his investigation in 1967. It would ultimately culminated with this failed attempt to prosecute Clay Shaw in 1969, which would lead to his acquittal after only 50 minutes of jury deliberation, which tells you how the jury was feeling about the whole thing. Garrison first detected the scent of a connection between the city of New Orleans and the Kennedy assassination, with some feedback coming from a man named Jack Martin, who brought to Garrison's attention the fact that this interesting character, Dave Ferry, could have potentially been involved. And based on that, Garrison started snooping around, a point that I feel like it's only responsible to make. I'm not very pro Jim Garrison, for the record, and I'm not just hammering him when I say this, but a point that I feel it's necessary to make is that this is a man that was in an elected office and paid by taxpayers, and he took the resources of the district attorney's office and went after this. He pursued a parade, an absurd parade, for reasons that we'll never know for sure, because of course, his life extended well beyond 1969, which is when the trial occurred. And in the remainder of his life, he would over and over again say, "No, I was looking for the truth." He would ultimately publish this book. What was it on the Trail of Assassins? During which, by the way, he never mentions the Clay Shaw trial, which should tell you a lot. The book comes out in 1988, well after the trial. And the trial, which marked an embarrassing turn in his life, is something that just conveniently not mentioned at all in that book. But Garrison took the resources of an office that had better things to do and pursued the potential connections to the assassination. New Orleans has connections to the assassination. There's no question about it. Lee Harvey Oswald was from here. Lee Harvey Oswald, throughout the trajectory of his life, goes away, but then returns to New Orleans. He had roots here. This is where he was from. In fact, I have bored hundreds of people in my life and pointing out and driving, going out of our way, making turns so that we can go out of our way so I could point out a house where Lee Harvey Oswald briefly lived when he lived in the city of New Orleans. There are 5 of them that I'm aware of, including one here on the North Shore, only about 5 miles away from where I'm sitting right now. So there's a connection here. It's just that connection was not a secret CIA operative who represented a part of a cell that included 3 shooter groups that set up an ambush that was coordinated by the U.S. intelligence gathering services and the United States military, all operating in one broad conspiracy during which they would assassinate the American president. For what reason? For what purpose? So that there then would be an escalation of our involvement in Vietnam. My question then is, how is it that the military and the intelligence services are directly benefited from that? Yeah, you could say that, well, because there was then a war in Vietnam, that the intelligence services and the military benefited directly from that. And I'm not sure that there was a lasting positive benefit from that. Yeah, there were lessons learned about how to wage modern, low-intensity guerrilla warfare, and the American military learned those lessons very painfully over the course of involvement in Vietnam. But in what way was the American military rewarded? And in response to September 11th conspiracies, what I was given to say was, if this movie is correct in accusing Clay Shaw and Dave Ferry as having been involved in a coup d'etat, why is it that then this was followed shortly thereafter by free, open, democratic, multi-party elections that resulted in the peaceful transition of power from one party to the other? If the whole point of assassinating John Kennedy in Dallas was so that we could then escalate the war in Vietnam, why then did the American people vote for Richard Nixon, who ran on a ticket of a vote for me will get us out of Vietnam? I'll pull us out of Vietnam. Why did the American people vote for him in such numbers? And then why did these same people who led this coup d'etat in 1963, why did they just walk away obediently in 1969? It makes no sense to me. But then again, I have been living in the New Orleans area for 25 years now. And I have been reading a lot of, Jim Garrison was dead before I moved here. So I never got to meet him, but I've met a lot of people that worked around him. And I have spent the last 25 years trying to make sense of Jim Garrison. And this thing that happened in 1969, this trial that he would base his book on the Trail of Assassins on, that would then form the basis for this movie. I'm still trying to make sense of all of that, and I have not managed to do so yet.
Well, I'm starting to get a sense for the original F- there, but you did mention a name, and there are a lot of names mentioned in the movie. We could have an entire series dedicated to just the intricacies of the names in there, but I wanted to mention some of the key people that are shown in the movie. You mentioned Dave Ferry. He's played by Joe Pesci. He's, according to the movie, he's a friend of Lee Harvey Oswald, who is seen working at Guy Bannister's office. That's another name that we'll come back to. But Dave Ferry has connections with the CIA. He has a quick temper, gets very upset at Kennedy for closing down the training camps. I'm assuming Dave Ferry was a real person then, and how was he portrayed in the movie?
I would say this, and this is a blanket statement that I think can be applied to all of the characters that appear in this movie. Joe Pesci plays a much more interesting Dave Ferry than Ferry played of himself. So something that I think needs to be said about the great compliment that I think needs to be paid to this movie is that it's the cast of this film is magnificent. Some of the greatest living actresses and actors in the 1990s are a part of this movie, and they left us some absolutely amazing performances. And Joe Pesci, I think, I have a hard time trying to decide who was the best actor in this movie. It's not Kevin Costner. It's either Kevin Bacon or Joe Pesci, or Tommy Lee Jones is pretty great in this movie. But I also feel like Walter Matthau was great. I think John Candy is spectacular. Yeah. Even though his role is not big, John Candy was just such a force to be reckoned with as an actor. And for God's sake, Joe Pesci, the man is an institution. He is a gift living among us. And he plays an excellent Dave Ferry. Dave Ferry was, I think, cut from the same mold that Jim Garrison and Lee Harvey Oswald were cut from, in that Dave Ferry was an oddball. He was a misfit. We pay him a compliment that he doesn't deserve when we imagine him being this secret CIA operative. I think that there's an innocence to the way that the movie is willing to believe things that wildly insane people said, so that we are taking the Dave Ferry that said things while fueled by alcohol at parties. We're taking those things at face value in this movie. We're imagining the world that Dave Ferry wanted us to imagine, the world in which he is centrally involved in substantial events in the world. The idea of him being a deeply consequential individual, when in reality, I think he was a very troubled guy who didn't make a big splash in the world and was beginning his drift into inconsequentiality when that was interrupted by the investigation that he would not live to see the end of. He would not live to see the trial that would ultimately fail to convict Clay Shaw. And in this way, I believe that Dave Ferry was just like Lee Harvey Oswald. He was narcissistic. He was self-centered. He was writing his own melodramatic narrative of the world when he was also a deeply troubled person. Dave Ferry, his big problem was that he keeps getting fired from jobs for inappropriate relationships with young boys. He doesn't manage to make it into the priesthood for reasons that are not officially declared, but they're probably related to things that would later trouble him when he's an airline pilot. He was an effective pilot. He was involved in the Civil Air Patrol, as ultimately we now know Lee Harvey Oswald and Dave Ferry were. The question is, were they all there as a part of some government conspiracy? I don't believe that 14-year-old Lee Harvey Oswald, who is a member of the same Civil Air Patrol wing as Dave Ferry, I don't believe Lee Harvey was under the employ of the intelligence services of the United States government at the ripe old age of 14. It looks pretty much like Dave Ferry was involved in that because it gave him access to what he was sexually attracted to, which was young boys. And Dave Ferry, as much as he liked to compliment himself and imagine himself being someone of significant importance and consequentiality, he really wasn't. You can't take what somebody fueled by a little bit of alcohol at a party, you can't take what they say at face value and overlay any degree of seriousness to it. And that's kind of what this case is built on. It's absurd to me that this case is as steeped in hearsay evidence as it is. Because when you look at the case that Jim Garrison will ultimately bring forward against Clay Shaw, he can't bring a case forward on Dave Ferry because Dave Ferry's dead by now. He was alive when the investigation began. He dies during the investigation. And the case that Garrison ultimately brings forward against Clay Shaw is absurd. There's no smoking gun. There's no solid evidence that provides any linkage, any meaningful linkage between this conspiracy between Clay Shaw and Dave Ferry to kill the President of the United States. Dave Ferry doesn't have any deep or lasting involvement in the Central Intelligence Agency. Interestingly, Clay Shaw is the one that has that. But his involvement it's an adjunct type of involvement. It's within the orbit of the overall mission of the CIA, but it's these domestic interviews of people involved in business. They're involved in business in hotspots in the United elsewhere in the hemisphere. And so Clay Shaw, I realize you asked me about Dave Ferry, but I'm on to Clay Shaw just for one moment. Clay Shaw had started the New Orleans International Trade Mart and was therefore involved in international trade and did a great deal of business with South America. And the CIA came to him periodically to ask him questions about the relationships through business that he had established in South America. And it was because the CIA was interested in what was going on in certain South American countries. And in this way, he's involved in the CIA. But it's not a secret or covert program, just for the record. It's a program that the CIA openly discusses. And it is not the cloak and dagger connection that Jim Garrison or Oliver Stone would want us to believe in. And Dane Ferry doesn't even have that involvement. Yeah, sure. At drunken parties after the assassination, he might have ranted and raved about this or that. But he wasn't quite as important in the grand scheme of things as he may have thought he was.
You mentioned some of the great actors, and another great actor, Ed Asner, he plays Guy Bannister, who, according to the movie, is a former FBI agent turned private investigator. And there's an interesting kind of tie that the movie has for Guy Bannister, and that is that his office is at 531 Lafayette Street, New Orleans. And then Garrison looks that up and he finds out that that is the same address as 544 Camp Street, which is an address associated with Lee Harvey Oswald. Was Guy Bannister real in this connection here?
My old neighborhood, by the way, from when I lived in downtown.
Oh, really?
One block away from all of that. So yeah, there's a connection there insofar as it's the same building. The argument that I make, and I have been making for 25 years now about this, is that just because they had offices in the same office building in downtown New Orleans doesn't mean they were involved in a conspiracy to murder the president of the United States. A further point I would make there is that there is a lot of obsessive orientalization of the city of New Orleans throughout this movie, meaning that this movie orientalizes or exoticizes the city of New Orleans, which is basically, if I can get this chip off my shoulder, that's what all movies do about us. Any movie treatment of the city of New Orleans inevitably involves Mardi Gras parades and beans being thrown and crawfish and all of these archetypal things that are just basically caricatures of what life is actually like living here. And one of the things I believe that people overlook, certainly something that I had to learn when I moved here, is that this is a small town. This is basically a big, small town. And it's an old town, one of the oldest in the country. And the result is that the class of people that evolve to become business leaders or legal leaders, everyone is very incestuous insofar as everyone knows each other and everyone's related to each other to some extent. And back then, in the early 1960s, it was even smaller. I'm going to mention this. This sounds like a stupid and silly aside, but there are two high-rise office buildings that dominate the downtown city of New Orleans landscape. One's called Place St. Charles. The other one's called One Shell Square. And all of these things happened before those buildings were built. And to this day now, if you meet anybody that works for a law firm, their firm is in one of those two buildings. If you meet anybody that's involved in investments or things like that, they're in one of those two buildings, or else a building that's nearby. At a time when downtown city centers made sense, at a time in our history when downtown city centers actually served a practical purpose. I argue that they no longer serve that purpose and that we're hanging on to them out of a sense of nostalgia more than anything. But back then, you had to have an office in downtown. Back before the construction of Place St. Charles and One Shell Square, there were only a handful of office buildings where you could have an office if you were involved in business in New Orleans. And so it seems like a howling absurdity to me for so much of this case to be built on the simple coincidence of a private investigator, Guy Bannister, inhabiting the same office building as the Fair Play for Cuba association that Lee Harvey Oswald was a part of. It's coincidence. That's the weird thing about the Jim Garrison case that ends up being made in 1969 is that so much of his case is built on these minor coincidences. And this is a coincidence that is occasioned to a significant degree on the fact that The city of New Orleans is not big. The number of people involved in the law, the number of private investigators that are, licensed by the state of Louisiana that are here in the city, it's not many. And this is a very parochial and closed net society. An experience that I had moving here 25 years ago was that they're reluctant to welcome outsiders. It's a small community that has small community qualities associated with it. And that kind of a reality, they're going to be coincidences. And if coincidences are to be elevated to the level of mass meta-narratives, you're going to find plenty of them in New Orleans. It's going to be endless. The fact that you've got Guy Bannister and Lee Harvey Oswald coming and going from the same office building, I think, is unimportant and meaningless.
That makes sense. I mean, yeah, that makes sense. But there's no such thing as coincidences when it comes to conspiracies.
When Overstone's involved, there are no coincidences. Yeah.
Yeah. Another character in the movie is Jack Ruby, played by Brian Doyle Murray. And the movie says that he worked for the mob, but he's in on the plot too because he was let into the police building by some of the guys inside so he could assassinate Lee Harvey Oswald as kind of a way of tying up all the loose ends. Did the movie do a good job explaining who Jack Ruby was?
I don't think the movie did. In fact, the Jack Ruby character of this movie it's a secondary character. Certainly Dave Ferry and Clay Shaw are more important in this narrative than Jack Ruby is, which I think is a little bit of an oversight. An argument that I find myself making, though, is that I believe that Jack Ruby is cut from the same cloth as Lee Harvey Oswald, as Dave Ferry, and as Jim Garrison, insofar as he imagined himself. There's an actual name for the disorder. I'm going to struggle to come up with the name, but it's the is it the chronic protagonist disorder? I think it's a name to that effect, and it's a disorder, a psychological disorder, in which you imagine yourself as being the lead character of or protagonist character of a narrative, and you imagine that narrative of what you want it to be. Like the imagined narrative of my life is one in which I'm powerful and successful and profitable, and anything that complicates that has obviously been introduced into the plot to make my struggle all the more difficult and challenging. And that's the way that they approach this sort of thing. Jack Ruby was on record saying, and Jack Ruby lived for a long time after he assassinated Lee Harvey Oswald. He was on record saying that he wanted to spare the First Lady the trauma of a trial. And oh boy, did he ever manage to do that. So the question is, I should specifically address your question. Your question is like, does the movie do him justice? I don't think the movie does him justice as a character, even if I were to step out of this very doubtful, unconvinced personality that I actually inhabit and become a true believer and gobble up everything that Oliver Stone has to offer for me. Even at that, he doesn't make much of the Jack Ruby character, and he doesn't do much with the story that I think really serves his narrative. Because his narrative is the assassination of JFK was the part of a coup d'etat, a conspiracy of intelligence services and the military. And if that's your story, the guy that sent in afterward, if they truly set Lee Harvey Oswald up to be a patsy and there were 3 shooter groups and the other 2 bailed on the mission to leave one so that the entire crime could be parked on top of one person's shoulders, and then Jack Ruby is sent in to clean up after that by killing him, I feel like the movie should have made a lot more of him. But this movie is already 3.5 hours long. This movie is already pretty darn long. There were moments in it where I was stopping and I was thinking, this movie would never exist in the contemporary 21st century social media Thunderdome, in which people can't pay attention to things for more than 10 seconds. Because think about it. All this movie is a bunch of white dudes monologue. The whole movie, the whole damn movie is just a series of white lead characters, like either like, I think this is what happened, or I didn't say that, I said this, ongoing. Like the point where another one of the just absolute master craftsmen who shows up in this movie is Donald Sutherland, for God's sake. Mm-hmm. And what I think is one of the coolest moments of the movie where Garrison flies to Washington and they're sitting on a park bench. It's very cloak and dagger. It's exactly the kind of thing I want out of a movie like this. It builds all this tension because he is the one that's describing the extent to which the military is involved in the conspiracy to assassinate the president. And it's a fascinating moment in the movie. And all it is two white guys on a park bench with one of them doing all the talking. And I was like, this movie would never be made today. This movie asked so much of a viewing audience. The way that I can look back at like movies that were made long before this, like movies you and I have even spoken about. Well, we didn't talk about Tora, did we? We didn't.
Not yet.
We talked. Yeah, that's the spirit. That's the spirit. The answer I was looking for. But like the movie, The Longest Day, that movie demands a lot from the audience. It demands that the audience, first of all, care, and that the audience then sit there, shut up, and listen for more than an hour and 45 minutes. And I believe that movie-going audiences do that much anymore. And also, this is a movie that on a couple of occasions, people slam Doors. Sissy Spacek slams, for God's sake, Sissy Spacek, who's Garrison's wife in this movie, one of the greatest actresses we've ever had. Sissy Spacek slams a couple of doors, and that's about as exciting as it gets. There's a lot of talking about shooting, but there's not really a lot of shooting. No explosions at all to be had anywhere in this movie. And so I don't know that a contemporary viewing audience would cleave to it the way that the viewing audience did in 1991. Because I remember it very clearly. And man, this movie, everyone loved this movie and everybody could not get enough of this movie. And it created an entire thing. I mean, this movie led to the JFK Act, which relates to the way that information is released about presidential assassinations. I mean, it beggars my mind to think that a movie came out and the Congress passed a law in response to this movie. This movie, which is a steaming pile of absurdities.
Well, you mentioned Clay Shaw. Of course, Tommy Lee Jones plays him. And according to the movie, he also goes by Clay Bertrand, although throughout most of the movie, he denies being Clay Bertrand. I think he admits it to a police officer once after he's being arrested. But then Clay Shaw, or Bertrand, or whatever his last name is.
Sometimes known as Clem Bertrand, too, by the way.
Oh, okay. Well, I don't know that the movie mentions that alias there. But
mention the Clem Bertrand. I mean, I don't want to call it an alias because Clay Shaw was not Clay Bertrand, and he wasn't Clem Bertrand either. There was yet another name that he supposedly was.
Okay. So, according to the movie, of course, that's the guy that you mentioned earlier that, Garrison brings the official lawsuit against. Were they separate people then? Clay Shaw, I'm assuming, was, as you talked about earlier, he was actually a real person, although not the person that we see necessarily in the movie.
Correct. He wasn't an actual living person. And this whole idea of him being implicated, Garrison's thoughts on this were basically people whispering in Garrison's ear that Dane Ferry and Clay Shaw were involved in this plot. Garrison then begins his witch hunt, which is what I think it was. And that witch hunt ultimately identifies these people. I feel like I need to get something off my chest real quick that I find not just problematic or troubling about this movie, but I find offensive about this movie. And that is that this movie is also a little bit of a witch hunt against homosexuals, because the way that homosexuality is depicted in this movie is it is depicted as deviancy. The people who are gay in this movie, they're not closeted. They're not quietly gay. They're over the top. They're notoriously gay, meaning that the word on the street or word around town is that Clay Shaw was a homosexual or was bringing young boys in. Homosexuality is treated as an indecency by this film. Another reason I believe that this movie wouldn't be made today. I mentioned earlier, I used the word orientalized, and that's coming from a book from a professor named Saeed. I can't remember his first name right now. called Orientalism that imagined a world that treats, it's a process of othering that you'll hear referred to frequently in the modern era of the social justice woke agenda. And this process of othering is often a process of treating them as bizarre and deviant and exotic. And that is definitely something that this movie does to homosexuality. And I believe that the recent reimagining of the way that our attitudes toward homosexuality would have thrown up barriers that would prevent this movie being made today. Those barriers didn't exist back in the late 80s, early 90s. And so here we have this movie and these characters who are victimized by Jim Garrison, victimized by this movie. Part of what makes them outrageous characters is their flamboyant homosexuality. And we see that in three characters in the movie. We see that with Joe Pesci's Dave Ferry. We see that with Tommy Lee Jones's Clay Shaw. And then we see that with a fictitious character that's played in a memorable way by Kevin Bacon, and the character's Willie O'Keefe, who was not a real person, but a person made up for the purposes of moving this narrative forward. Because the real person was not flamboyantly homosexual and not currently locked up in Angola prison in Louisiana. But certainly that sequence of scenes where Garrison travels to Angola prison, the William O'Keefe character is pulled off the work detail to give him, the DA, a few moments of interview. And then I remember it being memorable because a giggle erupted across the audience on opening night when I saw the movie in 1991. And that the giggle was caused by the fact that Kevin Bacon, and I said memorable, I'm not going to say he's necessarily good, because in many ways, the way he portrays this character would never float today. You would never get away with portraying a gay man like this today. But as he walks off, he mocks him as Kevin Costner's walking away. He's like, "Oh, Mr. Garrison, you're a good looking man. When I get out, I'd like to come see you." And the audience had a giggle at that, which is why that character was introduced and made the way he was, purposely to elicit the audience giggle. And this is good storytelling. It's good storytelling that would never float today because it's making the butt of the jokes something that we all accept as normal, which is homosexuality. And that's why this movie is such a fascinating journey to go back to it. I hadn't looked at it for about 5 years until you and I began to talk about it. And I watched it again, and the movie's fascinating and I love it. And it's actually extremely entertaining. And of course, I'm going to say that because I'm a middle-aged white guy. This is middle-aged white guy fan fiction is what this is. This was made for a specific audience, and it was conspiracy theory inclined middle-aged white men. And I would say that Oliver Stone is our sovereign, and he just loves to make the movies that serve up what we want served up. And this movie does it. And the movie has a little bit of a giggle at African-American people. It has a little bit of giggle at Southern people because of, for God's sakes, the accents that are in this movie just make me nauseous. It has a little bit of a giggle at gay people, which seems very adolescent, but that's the way it works. And it was fascinating to reacquaint myself with the movie. I think it's a good movie. It's weird to look at it through the lens of calendar year 2023, when looking back 30 years ago at what passed for a movie that everyone had to go see, and you had to go see it in the theater. It was a fascinating journey to reacquaint myself with the movie, and also to take note of the cultural changes that have emerged in the past 3 decades in the American experience, because those cultural changes are such that I think this is a movie that wouldn't happen now.
In the movie, right after the assassination, it mentions that Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, Earl Warren, is leading the investigation into the assassination. And then there is like this 3-year gap in the movie and the timeline to the rest of the movie throughout it. But it mentions the Warren Commission report. Can you give some historical context around the Warren Commission report and how that fits into the story?
Of course. The Warren Commission was an appointed commission. I mean, we call it that. That's not the official name of the commission, but it was the Presidential Commission for the Investigation of the Kennedy Assassination. Chief Justice of the United States Supreme Court, Earl Warren, he chaired the commission. In the movie, he is, of course, played by Jim Garrison in a weird turn of casting, but hey, whatever. Garrison was still alive. Garrison didn't have much longer to live at the time, but he makes some pretty convincing Earl Warren in the one scene that he appears and has dialogue. The commission was intended to investigate the assassination, figure out what happened, assemble all of the evidence associated with it, and produce a final report. The Warren Commission report, which was released publicly on September 24th, 1964. And when you think about it, it's not terribly long after the assassination for this to be an official 888-page document. The Warren Commission, the reason that it is memorable because it constitutes the U.S. government's official understanding of what happened. And from the Warren Commission report emerge a couple of stations of the cross, things that as decades would begin slipping by after September 1964, people would turn back to it. The Warren Commission report would be seed that was spread out in arable land that would grow eventually broad conspiracies. But I guess the most important thing coming out of the Warren Commission is the idea of a single shooter. Lee Harvey Oswald committed this crime. He did so by himself. He was not part of a conspiracy. He was not part of a broader operation. He acted alone. And then, most importantly, the single bullet theory, the idea that a single bullet passed through President Kennedy and also through Governor Connolly. And the reason that is significant is because if one bullet does produces the thoracic injury on the president and then also injures Governor Connolly, that means that it's not an ambush during which 6 shots are fired. It's an ambush during which 3 shots are fired. And that fundamentally removes conspiratorial possibilities from the equation. It's memorable because it's the government's official position. It's memorable because it establishes these central elements of the Kennedy assassination narrative. Single shooter, single bullet.
They published that publicly, right? So the public had access to it, or was that?
It was added to the congressional record, and as a result, by extension, it was made a public document.
Okay.
I mean, it was out there. I mean, by the time I read it because I saw this movie and I was like, man, that movie was awesome. That movie was great. I got to find out more about this conspiracy. And I just started reading, and I've been doing that ever since. I admittedly was aware of the Kennedy assassination, and I was alive and conscious for some critical developments over the course of that. The release of Zapruder film, public release, and then ultimately the broadcast of Zapruder, unedited Zapruder, the House Select Committee hearings on the assassination in 1976. I remember that directly. I was around for all that. I was a kid for most of it, but I became an adult eventually, and my interest in this subject was created in its entirety because this movie's so damn good.
You mentioned the Zapruder film, and in the movie, there's the trial. We'll get to the trial itself, but the movie does mention the Zapruder film as being seen for the first time at the trial. Was Jim Garrison kind of the one behind releasing the Zapruder film, like the movie implies?
Yeah, it had not been publicly seen. It was the Zapruder film was purchased by a private news entity immediately after the assassination. It was subpoenaed by the Warren Commission, and so commission members were able to view the footage, but it was not publicly released. When Jim Garrison staged his trial here in New Orleans in 1969, it was shown to the impaneled jury, and that constituted the first public viewing of Zapruder footage. Which, if I could just throw in a quick editorial comment about that, it fits perfectly the profile that I am developing of Jim Garrison. And many people howl about this and do not applaud what I'm about to say, but I believe that this was all done as a part of him grooming his legacy and grooming his own ego and attracting attention. Part of this man's reputation here in the city of New Orleans was for his flamboyance, for his tough on crime attitude, going after the bad guys and cracking down on moral crime. He had a reputation before this trial for pursuing the degenerate lawlessness and the indecency that was a part of the French Quarter, which is why I love to remind anybody who will listen of the fact that it shouldn't surprise us that people he's going after in this trial are people who are homosexual. I recognize that as an extension of Garrison's moral, his moral quest to cure the degenerate immorality that was so abundant on the streets of this city. And he was known for doing so in a very conspicuously public way. And I would argue that his making a jury look at the president's death in the Zapruder film footage, that was a part of his personality, that he was a little bit of a shock jock. He had to be known publicly. He was flattered by the idea that the newspapers talked about him. He liked being someone who was known around the city. In other words, he liked having climbed the ranks of hierarchy within the greater milieu of the urban environment of New Orleans to achieve the status of being an elite within this microcosm of a society. He enjoyed that. And anything that he could do to bring attention to himself, he frequently did, which is why he had so many arrests and so few convictions. He was known for dragnetting people in when he didn't have evidence to convict them. People that would get dragnet in and then ultimately released or acquitted, as was the case with Clay Shaw.
Interesting. So it sounds like he had a narrative of his own that is an important thing to keep in mind, because there are so many different narratives in a conspiracy around the assassination of the president, that if Jim Garrison, the real Jim Garrison, had his own narrative to, whether it be, being in the limelight or, getting his name out there or his own legacy and that aspect of it, it's a lot more than the Jim Garrison of the movie, which just seems to be, I'm here, I want to find the truth.
I am serving the noble cause of the truth. When in actuality, part of it, I think, was, well, why should Vincent Bugliosi and the Manson trials get all the attention? What about me? I realized the timing didn't work out. The Manson murders in the summer of '69, but there was a quality of back then, when there was no Instagram and no TikTok, and there were no influencers and social media didn't exist. The way you got your name out there was as a public servant. You got your name out there by being tough on crime, being a chief of police, or being a DA, or being a judge that was known for being tough on crime. And Garrison, from the start, was seeking public office. His first effort was he ran for a judge and he did not win. He then ran for district attorney and he won that and served as district attorney until 1973. He stepped down, but he stepped down in the middle of a big controversy about embezzlement and bribery, for the record. Of course, because he's from New Orleans and that's what we do here. We embezzle and bribe people. We have mayors stretching back time immemorial that have been involved in that sort of activity. But then after that, what did he do? He became a judge. This was a person who was after public office. He was after the limelight. He sought attention and he found it. When with that trial, he became a bit of a household name. He was a household name here in New Orleans. But you didn't have to necessarily work too hard to achieve that status around this city, because after all, it wasn't really a big city. Still isn't. Yeah, there's this further incident that I feel like I should just mention. It has nothing to do with the movie, but it's something that actually happened in the real world. And that is that apparently he had a little bit of an axe to grind. And I mean, this is all hearsay. This is stuff that I've read about, but why the hell can't I do it? Oliver Stone and Jim Garrison did it. Why can't I do it too? Why can't I just talk out a story because somebody told me? They did it. They made movies and books about it. But there's a story around town here that was very well known, that Garrison had gotten sloppy drunk at a famous restaurant in town, and slapped his wife. And he got tackled by a bunch of dudes, one of which was Clay Shaw. And hustled him outside and kicked him out on the street, because you're not going to hit a woman in this establishment, even if she is your wife. If you're going to hit her, do the right thing. Go home and hit her in the privacy of your own home. You're not going to do it in public. And if that did happen, I see no reason to not believe it. I find no reason to challenge that piece of evidence if I'm to believe everything that Oliver Stone and Jim Garrison want me to believe that has absolutely no proof. Why can't I believe this story? And if that's the case, I can understand why Jim Garrison might have a little case of rage when it came to Clay Shaw, this prominent businessman who suspiciously didn't have a wife or children, but he was also prominent and he was involved in business and had a lot going on. Why not go after him? He's an easy target. Back then, it was easy to break down someone for no other reason than they were gay. They were guilty of being homosexual. We have to remember that this was a little bit of a homosexual witch hunt, because that's who this trial targeted. That's who was on trial here. Dave Ferry, Clay Shaw, both of whom were gay. And I'm not saying that the entirety of this was built on their homosexuality, but I believe that it was a part of it in Jim Garrison's mind. Jim Garrison, who was on the self-appointed crusade to cure the city of New Orleans of all of its moral degeneracy. And back then, people like Jim Garrison thought that gay men were moral degenerates.
Interesting. And if that story did actually happen, Clay Shaw bringing him down too, somebody that would have publicly humiliated Garrison in that way, at a restaurant like that, that could be, just something else. I could see that being speculating, of course, but I mean, yeah.
Yeah, it's all speculation. I don't mean to interrupt you, but if I could just make this one powerful point, I think a lot of what this story devolves into is palace intrigues. One night out, supposedly Jim Garrison slapped his wife at the restaurant. Clay Shaw was one of the men that threw him out, helped the others haul him out onto the street. And then supposedly there was a party. Dave Ferry was there, and this guy Leon Oswald was there, and someone overheard Clay Shaw and Lee Harvey Oswald talking about the assassination shortly after it happened. A lot of this story is nothing but this absurd scuttlebutt hearsay. And a proper trial very quickly eliminates that kind of nonsense. I believe that is, to a significant degree, why this jury deliberated for 50 minutes and came back with a unanimous verdict.
Something that's not hearsay, though, that we did talk about very briefly, but I wanted to get into a little bit more, is the Zapruder film. And according to the movie, it's a 8mm film taken by Abraham Zapruder, who happened to be standing near the grassy knoll shooting the president's motorcade shooting with film the president's motorcade that day. And then what he captured turned into the footage that's, according to the movie at least, is used to determine the timeline between the shots as being 5.6 seconds. And also mentioned that Oswald used a bolt action rifle. And then the movie seems to imply that it's impossible to get off that many shots in that time period with that rifle. Do you think that's possible?
The movie does not just imply that. The movie says that.
That's true. They mentioned, I think the FBI sharpshooters tried to redo it and they couldn't do it. And I think they said Oswald was like a medium shot at best or something like that. Yeah.
Do you want to dig into all of that now, or shall we wait? Because it is about to hit the fan. Effectively, everything that this movie does in presenting and exhibiting anything related to firearms in general, or the specific firearms involved in this incident, everything that this movie does is absolute rubbish, absolute unquestionable nonsense. Let me just chip at it one by one. First and foremost, the idea that Lee Harvey Oswald was a poor shot. A big point that is made in the movie is when he entered the United States Marine Corps, he had to qualify. Every Marine's a rifleman. And there are 3 levels to qualification. And if you qualify expert, you've shot a near perfect score, and that's the highest level. There are 2 levels below it. And if you score lower than the bottom level, you have to requalify. You have to go over it again. So the lowest level of qualification is still qualification. You're still a qualified U.S. Marine rifleman. And at recruit training, Lee Harvey Oswald reached that lowest level. That's nothing to be ashamed of. Not a lot of Marines qualify expert. Qualifying expert is not something that is easily achieved. It requires somebody that's got unique skills with the rifle. And usually what leads you to qualifying expert at recruit training is you've got some rifle marksmanship practice to begin with. So to suggest that Lee Harvey Oswald was a poor marksman is an absurdity. He was a qualified U.S. Marine rifleman. End of story. That means he qualified. Just because he didn't qualify at the highest possible level doesn't mean that he was any less qualified. The Zapruder film, your questions about Zapruder, what the film depicts is Abraham Zapruder had positioned himself in Dealey Plaza in such a position where he's looking from an elevated position down on to Elm Street, and he films the presidential motorcade. He's focused on the lead limousine that has President and Mrs. Kennedy and Governor and Mrs. Connell and their driver. He is filming through the critical moments of the ambush. He is, unfortunately, the limousine was passing behind a sign announcing the right turn for the Stemmons Expressway. Not necessarily the right turn, announcing that the Stemmons Expressway turn was coming up. As the presidential limousine passed behind that sign, we believe that's when the thoracic injury struck the president in his back, bullet that also then subsequently struck Governor Connolly. Then as the vehicle emerges from behind the Stemmons Expressway sign, you can see that President Kennedy is putting his mouth toward his throat, which is where his exit wound was. And you can see that Governor Connolly is also wincing and kind of curling up a little bit as the presidential limousine continues onward with the president in this position. He drops his hands and he slumps forward a little bit with Jackie beginning a process of, she's like got her hand on his back. She's trying to console him. And Zapruder was filming at the point where the president sustains a head wound. We still argue about which wound was fatal, and it's irrelevant. Both wounds, if they were, either one was isolated and the other didn't happen, they were fatal. So the president was already dead from his thoracic wound. Maybe he still had heartbeat and he still had respiration, but he was dead. He was a dead man before the head wounds hit him. And you've seen it. We've all seen it. It's a graphic depiction of a human being being hit in the head by a bullet from modern repeating rifle. Another part of your question was about the timing of the shots. One thing that we do know is that a complete and utter mess has been made about the issue of timing, to where this idea has circulated since Warren Commission of 5.6 seconds for the rifleman to have completed 3 shots. Part of what is being argued in the Garrison case is that it was a conspiracy. There were 3 shooter teams and there was more than 3 shots. They were able to conclude that the shots cover a broader period of time, and the timing was arrived at by Zapruder, which, by the way, there's no audio on that footage. It's silent film. In 1976, there was a presidential select, or the House Select Committee on the assassination, which examined audio evidence of one of the city of Dallas mounted patrol officers who had his microphone open throughout the entire ambush. And these charlatans came forward and suggested that they could analyze the audio that was recorded, and that they came up with more shots. They came up with an idea that, of course, disagreed with Warren Commission, which, of course, went forward with the single gunman, 1 bullet theory. Garrison supports the idea of multiple shooters and more than 3 shots. House Select Committee hearings, multiple shooters, potentially more than 3 shots. What Warren Commission came up with was timing based on what they were watching at the Zapruder silent film, based on the president's reactions to injuries. They interviewed everybody that was in the plaza at that time. They interviewed all the Secret Service agents. They developed a timeline, and the timeline, it suggests not 5.6 seconds of elapsed time for 3 well-aimed rifle shots. It indicates a longer period of time. But I want to say that is irrelevant for the purposes of me responding to your question, because the central question that exists here that I have been living with for over 30 years, ever since this movie came out, was, can someone deliver 3 well-placed, aimed shots from a military surplus bolt-action rifle in 5.6 seconds? And the answer is not just yes, but it is, oh, hell yes, they can, because I have done it. I'm not military trained, but I've been shooting all my life. I do it all the time. In fact, if you would ever like to go look at any of the evidence of time me, I have probably 2 or 3 dozen videos on my YouTube channel of me firing bolt action rifles and hitting a gong at a range that's comparable to the assassination range, 88 meters for the third shot, the headshot. It's such an absurdity that this movie tries to make Lee Harvey Oswald out to not being an adequate rifleman. It's such a complete, miserable, howling absurdity that this movie suggests that someone cannot deliver 3 aimed shots at a target that's less than 100 meters away with a military bolt action rifle, and they can't do it in 5.6 seconds. All of that is such hogwash that I have lost my patience with 30 years of dealing with this. It's to the point that I went and built an Oswald rifle, and I did it myself. I've done it. I do it every single time I do it. But one of the things that this movie does is it wants to take basically empirical evidence and make you question it. And this movie is doing that at every turn. There is an empiricism here. It is an absolute. We cannot argue the point. Lee Harvey Oswald was a qualified U.S. Marine rifleman. There are no opinions that matter. That is a statement of cold, hard fact. Another statement of cold, hard fact is that a moderately skilled rifleman can connect with a target that's 100 meters, less than 100 meters away with a military bolt-action repeating rifle in under 5.6 seconds. It's definitely possible. But this movie, after it entered the American cultural zeitgeist, it has led now to millions of little experts walking the streets of our fair country who have been taught by a movie, first of all, that Lee Harvey Oswald was a poor rifleman and nobody can do that anyway. One of the evidence pieces that they will frequently point to is that when CBS News and a couple of news agencies set up a course of fire that imitated the course of fire that was delivered at Dealey Plaza, November 22nd, 1963, what they love to point out, and the movie says that they brought in military marksmen and they couldn't complete the course of fire. And in the example of CBS Evening News, they brought in snipers. God knows what training these guys had. God knows if they were actually snipers or if they were people that, like Lee Harvey Oswald, wore a U.S. military uniform and qualified with a rifle. They could have just been that. Who knows? But they had military members that came in and couldn't do it. However, the person that they had used to get the rifle for the CBS Evening News test was a World War II veteran by the name of Howard Donahue. And when these military members couldn't complete the course of fire, and I would argue there's a reason for that, and that is that the military members that they use, they received basic training in the semi-automatic rifle era of the American military, which I think is quite a bit different than the old bolt-action rifle era of the American military. We were putting people through basic training using 5-shot manually operated bolt-action rifles all the way up through the Second World War. After that, Americans are going through basic training and they're qualifying at first on the M1 rifle. My father went through U.S. Army basic training in 1959. He qualified with the M1 rifle, semi-automatic rifle. After that, there was a transition to the M14 rifle, which was a select fire rifle that could be a semi-automatic or a fully automatic rifle. And then we moved on to the M16 family of rifles. And so I would argue that, yeah, it might be a little bit different for somebody who, as a result of their time in the military, had not really worked with military bolt-action rifles. This might be a silly point to make, but it's a point that I've convinced myself it's something worth considering. Howard Donahue, though, who was the man that obtained the rifles that were used in the CBS Evening News testing, he watched 3 military members who couldn't complete the course of fire, and he said, well, let me try it. He got up there and smoked. They had him do it smoked it the second time. Howard Donahue, who was a World War II U.S. Army veteran, he was in the U.S. Army Air Forces and is an aerial gunner, but he was somebody that knew how to shoot. And he got out there with the exact type of rifle that Lee Harvey Oswald used, and he smoked it. So this absurdity of over and over again saying the professional snipers couldn't repeat it, it's nonsense. Yeah, you can find people that couldn't do it, but you could also find people who could. And you are currently recording a podcast with one of the people because I've done it and I wasn't military trained. That's just, if I could throw this in, another editorial comment, those shots are not just easy, but they are pathetically easy. Much is made in this movie of nobody could complete these shots and do so in such a condensed amount of time. Yeah, they can. These shots are all under 100 meters. And with the firearm that was used, firing the cartridge that was used, which was a flat trajectory, 162 grain bullet going about 2,400 feet per second, which is pretty fast. There's functionally zero bullet drop at less than 100 meters. So it's a simple matter of chamber your round, drop your front sight on your target, and squeeze the trigger. These shots are not challenging, and it has fascinated me to mature all the way into my adulthood in the aftermath of this motion picture. And this motion picture told an entire generation of people it can't be done. And these people listened to that. They're more willing to listen to Oliver Stone than the actual record. And I find that fascinating.
That is one of the core things I think that you get out of the movie as well. It's not possible to get those shots off. So obviously there had to have been another shooter or, something else. Obviously there's something else going on.
If you're going to build up a BS case, you got to build that BS on something. Why not build it on, it can't be done. There's not enough time. They always, and like a thing that also irritates me to no end is that the movie, it includes the lines of dialogue with a cheap, poor quality Italian World War II rifle. You haven't asked yet, but I'm just going to go ahead and throw this in because it feels timely. But the firearm that was used was an Italian Carcano model 9138 infantry rifle. I'm not going to pronounce it in Italian. That would be pretentious anyway. It was chambered for the Italian 6.5 by 52 millimeter rifle cartridge. And that cartridge accelerates a long, round-nosed 162 grain bullet. And from that barrel, which I believe the barrel length is 18.5 inches on that firearm, you get about 2,400 feet per second out of that cartridge. It's a smaller bullet. 6.5 millimeter is, what is that? Let's say 25 caliber. Think of it like that. You're getting 25 caliber, a heavy 25 caliber bullet going 2,400 feet per second. So it's a flat shooting firearm. Over and over again, people love to call this negative attention to that rifle, the Carcano model 9138 infantry carbine. And there's absolutely nothing wrong with that firearm. It's an excellent firearm. So not only am I going to disagree with what the movie wants to tell you, I am going to say, not only is it not that it's a bad rifle, I think it's a particularly good firearm. What the Italians had done, and here's a detail that I think might edify the listening public understanding of this entire incident. The Italians had recognized that in the aftermath of the First World War, the Italians are a major part of the First World War. They have a lot of troops that are out on the battlefield using the old Italian model 1891 Carcano rifle that had a 32-inch massive barrel. And the Italians realized that the barrel of that weapon made it possible for you to deliver rifle fire accurately. The sights were graduated to 1,500 meters on that firearm, maybe even 2,000. But the Italians quickly realized after World War I, we're not fighting like that. In the future, it's going to be mechanized warfare. We're not going to exchange small arms fire at these broad distances greater than 1,000 meters. And so the Italians in 1938 make a couple of critical decisions about what they're going to do in terms of manufacturing infantry weapons. And that is they still have a full-length rifle in the form of the model 1941 Carcano rifle, and it has an adjustable rear sight assembly with graduated out to 1,500 meters. They then decide to issue carbines or shorter barreled firearms. And those carbines do not have adjustable rear sights. They have a fixed sight. And the thinking is that we're going to fix the sight at a 300 meter zero. And so anytime you engage a target, the reality is you're probably not going to shoot at anything more than 300 meters away. And if somebody's going to do that, it's going to be the infantry armed with the model 1941 rifle with adjustable sights. They have a rifle that is more appropriate for longer engagement distances. But for the closer engagement distances that really characterize modern warfare, they design a rifle with no sight adjustability. It's set at the factory, 300 meters zero. That's the model, Carcano Model 9138 infantry carbine. And that's what Lee Harvey Oswald used. When that firearm, it was 9138 infantry carbine, serial number C2766. Just for the record, the National Archives has lots of photos of the weapon on the internet. And on the Wikipedia page, the rifle itself has a Wikipedia page. But when the rifle was imported in the United States, these surplus rifles were coming into the U.S. in the 1950s and into the 1960s. And as these firearms came in, they were finding that people didn't want the Italian 9138 carbines because they didn't have sight adjustability and there was no means to mount a scope on it. And surplus World War II firearms were being used in the U.S. mainly for deer hunting. And so for somebody that has his sights set on deer hunting, they weren't buying these Italian Model 9138 Carcano infantry carbines. Klein's Sporting Goods in Chicago, Illinois, brought in a quantity of these rifles, mostly from Finland. And when they came in, they were the 9138 infantry carbine with no rear sight adjustability. And they understood that their market was selling to men that would potentially use this rifle for deer hunting. And it was a little bit less desirable because not only can you not put a scope on it, but you can't even adjust the rear sight. And so people weren't buying it. Klein Sporting Goods dealt with it by reaching out to a company called Ordnance Optics, based in Culver City, California, out of a gun store that still exists to this day called Martin B. Redding in Culver City. Martin B. Redding had placed an order with a Japanese factory to manufacture telescopic sights. And the Japanese produced them. They're cheap. They're really garbage. But nevertheless, they came into the country. Klein's Sporting Goods in Chicago, which is the company that imported Carcano Model 9138 infantry carbine, serial number C2766. When Klein's imported that rifle, they imported hundreds of others just like it. They then contacted Martin B. Redding in Culver City, California, and bought scopes for the firearms. And they made a simple pressed steel scope mount. When Klein Sporting Goods reached out to Martin B. Redding and they told them, "Yeah, we're going to put these on these Italian 9138 carbines." And Martin B. Redding went, "Well, the way that the mount works is it won't be able to fit. We'll have to make a modification to the mount to shave off one corner of it. But we'll do that for you, and then we'll send you the scopes and the mounts." And so they were sent, and the scope was on the rifle because the rifle has a rear sight that's not adjustable. And that was Klein Sporting Goods trying to take an old Italian military service rifle and make it appropriate for deer hunting by putting a scope on it. The reality is that the Ordnance Optics scopes were just complete garbage. And we believe that what happened is that Lee Harvey, famously ordered the rifle from Klein Sporting Goods. It was delivered to his P.O. box, a P.O. box that was under an assumed name, A. Hiddell. And he then apparently used the rifle to take shots at General Alvin Walker at Turtle Creek in Dallas on April 10th, 1963, and then used it again during the assassination in November. A possibility that I've considered in dealing with these scopes and dealing with these rifles kind of a lot is that when he shot at General Alvin Walker on April 10th, 63, he aimed the firearm through the scope, and he got a broad miss, and that when he opened fire at Dealey Plaza, he may have gotten a miss that fell short of presidential limousine, and that as he racked it, he sighted his second and third shots not using the scope, but using the iron sights on the weapon. And those iron sights would be accurate at the ranges involved because the range for the headshot was 88 meters. This rifle was zeroed at 300. So it's a matter of, it was the quality of the firearm should never be a part of this discussion because the Italian military was a formidable and effective modern military with excellent infantry weapons. The Model 9138 Carcano infantry carbine was an extremely effective firearm. It was capable of delivering these shots effectively. It wasn't poor in quality. Lee Harvey Oswald was a qualified U.S. Marine marksman, and he could have completed those shots in the allotted time, just like lots and lots of people have since the assassination took place. So these matters, which let's face it, these are central matters in this movie. Poor quality rifle. He didn't have enough time and he was a poor worksman. They're all complete falsehoods.
Well, speaking of Lee Harvey Oswald, again, played by another great actor, Gary Oldman, in the movie.
Yes, played the better Lee Harvey than Lee Harvey did. And Oldman, it's so rich. And like, I don't mean to hijack you, but the way Oldman portrays this character is he's very sharp. He's very smart. He's very dialed in. And there's a point where, famously Lee Harvey Oswald was, I'm gesturing toward Canal Street, which is that way across the way.
I was going to say, is there something?
There's a link between me there, but 30 miles that way is the Canal Street. But famously, Lee Harvey set up on Canal Street in downtown New Orleans, was distributing paraphernalia, distributing these pamphlets about Marxism, about the Communist Manifesto, and about Free Cuba, independent or Castro's Cuba. And there's film footage of that because the local NBC affiliate here, WDSU, sent a reporter out. They got word like, hey, there's a nutball out here on Canal Street trying to convince people that the Communist Manifesto is a good thing and that he's a declared socialist and he wants to talk to people about Marxism. And so this old anchor from WDSU, a man, he's no longer alive, but his name was Alec Gifford. And Gifford went down with the camera, and that's where that footage came from, of Lee Harvey in his little white short sleeve shirt with his little black skinny tie, handing out pamphlets to people that don't want anything to do with him. And Gifford struck up a conversation with him and invited him back to the studio. And Lee Harvey took the bait, went back to the studio and sat down. And that's this famous interview. Maybe you've heard it, but it's out there, of Lee Harvey is basically given what Lee Harvey wanted most, which was somebody to listen to him rant and rave. And so for 3 hours, he ranted and raved in the studio at WDSU to Alec Gifford. And that's on record. And he was a certifiable lunatic. That's who committed this crime. He was a high school dropout, paranoid schizophrenic with delusions of grandeur. And I think what the American people have a hard time swallowing is that there are a lot of those out there. Do you remember March 30th, 1981, where one of them attempted to assassinate Ronald Reagan? Why? Because he wanted to impress Jodie Foster. Those people are out there. They're on our streets. They live among us. And we have so many mentally ill people in this country. All countries have that. And it is irresponsible, I think, for people like Jim Garrison and Oliver Stone to come forward and to take the attention away from where it should be depart. And that is on the mentally ill person who obtained a firearm and used it to kill the president of the United States.
In the movie, he does mention, I think they mentioned like a TV debate or something where he says he's not a communist, he's a Marxist-Leninist, being a supporter of Castro. And so that kind of ties into the whole Cuba situation and that narrative that's going on in the film as well. So it sounds like it's pulling at least some bits and pieces from the real Lee Harvey Oswald there in the movie to try to piece him together. Do you think the movie did a good job of kind of showing his background?
Absolutely. But if anything, what I would have appreciated was a more thorough character profile. I mean, I realize this is absurd because Oliver Stone made the movie that Oliver Stone wanted to make. And it's an extremely good movie. It's extremely entertaining. And I have like every new cast member that would come on, I go, oh my God, he was in this. I forgot. Or she was in it. Look at this movie. For God's sakes, John Candy is in this movie and he's magnificent. And I love the movie. The movie, I think that, full disclosure, living in the New Orleans area and being somebody that pays attention to the subject, you eventually get sort of drawn into meditations on what Lee Harvey Oswald and who he was. Because if you get interested in the subject, you quickly find the houses, because they're all still standing, where he lived around the city. You quickly sort of acquaint yourself with some of the details of the trajectory of his life when he was in New Orleans. And he was in New Orleans 1 minute and then gone, and then back again, and then gone, and then back again. He's here in New Orleans when he's born. Then he goes off to New York with Margarita's mother, and then they're back in Louisiana. And then they go to Fort Worth and then back to Louisiana. And he's a truant. He's in trouble, and he dropped out of high school in Louisiana, and they moved to Texas, and he dropped out of high school again, and then he joins the Marine Corps. So he goes away to the Marine Corps, but he ends up at Keesler Air Force Base in Mississippi, not far away. And so then he's back sort of in New Orleans. But then he gets out of the Marine Corps and what was it? It was September 1959. What does he do? He goes to the Soviet Union by way of France, England, and Finland. And he's gone there for just under 2.5 years. And then he comes back. And where does he go? He's in New Orleans again. And then he goes to Texas. And then he's back in New Orleans. And then in 63, famously, he goes back to Texas and he never leaves Texas again, never comes back to Louisiana. But he's a part of this metropolitan area. And you end up in living here having this slant toward understanding his world. And his world was a little bit of a weird world. His mother his mother was a sociopath. I think it's very clear based on every report that was ever written about her. She had a couple of psych evaluations done. She was clearly an emotionless sociopath, which I believe is where he got some of his sociopathic qualities. He was given absolutely no affection. His father died 2 months after he was born in 1939, so he didn't have a father figure. His mother figure was completely detached, unemotional, and unaffectionate, most important. And he's living in a world where he's a little bit of a transient. I think by age 20, he had lived in 22 different places. And that takes a toll on somebody. He was a person that I think was inclined to paranoid schizophrenia just by birth. And then he was born into an environment that drew out all of that paranoia and blossomed into a very, very emotionally complex person, and a person who needed help and existed in a world that wasn't slowing down to give him help. Much is often made about how he was a devout communist, and he really wasn't. He, I believe, espoused Marxism, and he was espousing it at an early age when he was high school aged. Keep in mind, he never finished high school. He never got beyond the 10th grade. But he was espousing it. Why? It was at a time in the mid to late 50s when he would have been what we call today on the internet an edgelord, somebody that pushes every argument and every discussion toward crossing a line, making it borderline inappropriate, walking up to the edge and poking people and prodding people. Lee Harvey was a 1950s edgelord because it was edgy as hell in the 1950s as a little kid to be spouting off quotes from Das Kapital, Communist Manifesto, and talking about Marxism at a time when the Soviet Union was the archenemy of the United States of America. And he was doing it, I believe, because it rewarded him. It rewarded him with attention. And people like him are out there looking for attention at all times. He had delusions of grandeur. And when he presented himself to the Soviet Union during his defection, I really feel like the Soviets very quickly sniffed out, this guy is nothing. Who is this bottom feeder? He talked us into thinking he was going to give us all these great secrets about Marine aircraft, because that's what he was doing when he was in the Marine Corps. And they very quickly realized this guy's nothing. He's a nobody. He's a bottom feeder. Why did we do this? And they tried to send him out of the country a couple of times. At first, when he attempted to defect, they told him no, and they didn't want him. They denied him the visa to enter the country. And he engaged in this little show of an attempt of suicide. That's when he was still in Finland. And based on that, they eventually let him in. He eventually had high-level meetings, and they listened to him, during which he promised that he was going to give them all these great secrets, which I believe is part of the average profile of a paranoid schizophrenic, a delusional paranoid schizophrenic. The Soviets, after they realized he was pointless and meaningless and he couldn't give them anything they wanted, they packed him away working in an electronics plant where he harassed one woman and proposed to her until she said no. And then he eventually met Marina and he married her. And eventually they were just so sick of him that they isolated him at this electronics factory because he had nothing to offer. When he decided to leave, his decision to leave was based on the fact we have his account of it because he had journal notes where he said, they have no bowling alleys. They have no decent dance halls. There's nothing to do here. I get well paid, but I have no place to spend the money. All we have are these state-sanctioned dances once a month, and it's nothing like what I expected. And it's because he got over to the Soviet Union, and the Soviet Union him, and they showed him the reality of what it was like to be a part of the workers' revolution, and that was You lived in a culture that was characterized by shortage. He got sick of it. And it didn't take long for him to get sick of it. Like most young people who impetuously gravitate toward Marxist ideas, principles that seem like they make sense to your very youthful and pragmatic mind, like most people, he then eventually began to back away from it to such an extent that he had technically never officially renounced his U.S. citizenship. So he was still sort of an American citizen. He asked to come back to the U.S., and he even applied for and received a grant for a loan by which his travel expenses to come back to the USA were covered by the State Department. And then he gets back here, and what does he do? He takes a trip to Mexico and goes to the Soviet embassy there and tries to get them to believe, what? I've got secrets to tell that I can share with you. Over and over again, he's looking for an audience. He's looking for the consequentiality of the man that's standing up there sharing ideas that people stop and pay attention to. And more, the world was a world that would not stop and pay attention to Lee Harvey Oswald until he figured out how to make the world stop and pay attention once and for all.
The movie puts forward kind of the idea that Oswald was a part of the American intelligence, because it talks about like the heart of the U.S. government intelligence in New Orleans, the CIA, the FBI, the Office of Naval Intelligence, all having offices near where this office we talked about, with Guy Bannister and Lee Harvey Oswald in that same sort of area. Do we know if there was a connection between Oswald and American intelligence, or was it kind of what you were talking about where he promised that he, coming back from the Soviet Union, maybe made some promises, but never really was able to fulfill them?
He was never connected to the American intelligence community. He might have imagined himself as that. But anyone who works in mental health will be quick to tell you that a pattern of delusional paranoid schizophrenia is that people often imagine themselves like it's to the point that it's even part of sort of a joke about mental health. And that is, they imagine themselves as Napoleon, or they imagine themselves as being a consequential and important figure when they're really inconsequential and unimportant. So this narrative of him being a secret CIA operative, it's nonsense. I'm not aware of the CIA working with people who attempted to defect to the enemy side, particularly when they're high school dropouts. The image that we are given of Lee Harvey Oswald by this movie, which is why I expressed, when you asked me about how he's portrayed, I expressed disappointment. And I started to say, I believe Gary Oldman he's one of the best actors in this movie, and he plays a great job of making me believe Lee Harvey Oswald was capable of being this secret double agent. When, if you listen to the Alec Gifford interview with Lee Harvey Oswald, you can go, no, this guy is a nitwit. He's not capable of that. He's definitely not that kind of an undercover operative. He's not in the intelligence community. He's not involved in espionage. His brain is too crammed full of noise from his mental illness for him to have been this secret operative. But nevertheless, this movie wants us to believe that this delusional misfit high school dropout was a CIA operative. And why do we believe that? Because somebody whispered it at some point to Jim Garrison. That's not a lot to build the story on. You have no proof of it. For the entirety of this narrative comes from someone in the New Orleans area going, hey, that Lee Harvey guy, just like Dave Ferry, they're CIA. They were involved in the Cuba thing. And just because he published pamphlets about Cuba and he stood on the street corner at Canal Street and distributed pamphlets about Marxism doesn't mean that he's a spy. And it doesn't mean that he's working for the CIA. And nevertheless, this movie entered our cultural mainstream to such a powerful degree that I find it very difficult to convince people of otherwise. I find it very difficult to pull people away from the belief that Oliver Stone threw on them like a sack of rocks. It's to the point where I think that people continue to believe it because they want to. I think people want to believe it because, let's face it, this is the fan fiction that the audience wanted. What the audience wanted in the 1990s was disillusionment and cynicism, be suspicious of the government. This happened, everything happened in this rapid, dizzying succession because our CIA was out there and up to things. Now, the reason that people want to believe that is because those are things that actually happened during the Cold War. Project MK Ultra happened with absolutely no congressional oversight. So yeah, anything's believable at this point. But just because anything is believable doesn't mean that everything is believable. They want us to think that Lee Harvey was a secret government agent, and it created almost like a cottage industry of people spinning off and improvising on that idea. I think that the book that I find to be the most laughably hilarious of them all is this book, Dr. Mary's Monkey. Perhaps you're not familiar with it because you're a normal human being that doesn't spend looking absurdities. But there's a book called Dr. Mary's Monkey that came out that imagined that there was a woman that worked for the Board of Health in New Orleans. It was named Dr. Mary Sherman, and she was murdered under suspicious circumstances in 1964. And this book imagines that she was murdered as a part of a cover-up for an accident where what she was working on was the super virus that would ultimately become the AIDS virus, and that there was an accident in the laboratory and that a CIA handler was there to protect her and was ultimately given the mission of killing her to cover up the evidence of the CIA's development of this super virus. And the handler that killed Dr. Mary Sherman was none other than Lee Harvey Oswald. And my thought is, like, how did that happen? How did he become that? The high school dropout that, was truant so frequently that there were psychological evaluations done of him and his mother when they lived in New York. The kid that was so nomadic that he barely had an address that lasted for a year. How is it that this nomad misfit that didn't even finish high school and apparently had 103 point IQ, how is it that he was the CIA operative who in 1964, when he was at the ripe old age of, what was he, 39, 64, he was born in 39, so he's 25 years old. At the ripe old age of 25 with no high school diploma, he is this highly important CIA operative that is sent in to kill this doctor who was working on the AIDS virus. That's a book out there that I ended up reading it because I had so many people locally ask me about the book, to where I was like, what is it? It's an art piece? And I ended up reading the book. And at the end of it, I thought, part of me wanted to giggle and riff about it and make it stand-up comedy. But then part of me was like, this is how serious a cultural phenomenon Oliver Stone's movie is. Because if it wasn't for Oliver Stone's movie, JFK, the book, Dr. Mary's Monkey, wouldn't exist. If it wasn't for Oliver Stone's JFK, the idea of the Italian service rifle being poor quality, that wouldn't exist. The idea of Lee Harvey Oswald not being a good shot, that wouldn't exist. The idea of the magic bullet nonsense would not be a mainstream idea that's welcomed by more people than dismissed. But this movie did it. This movie changed the way that we think of the Kennedy assassination.
Which is fascinating. I mean, for a movie to be able to do that. We talked earlier about the whole 5.6 seconds, and there's another timeline that I wanted to ask you about in the movie that kind of puts forward some doubts as to Oswald's involvement in this. And this is something that Jim Garrison in the movie describes to the court. He says that Lee Harvey Oswald worked at the book depository, and around 12:15 p.m. that day, November 22nd, 1963, he was spotted on the second floor snack room. And then a maximum of 90 seconds after Kennedy is shot, a patrolman named Marion Baker ran into Oswald there on the second floor. Meanwhile, at the same time, there was a witness on the street named Arnold Rowland who said they saw two men in the sixth floor window. And on top of that, another worker named Bonnie Ray Williams ate his chicken lunch on the sixth floor at some point between 12:15 and 12:20 and didn't see anybody. So in the movie, Garrison says that we're to believe the Warren Commission report. Oswald shot 3 bolt-action shots in 5.6 seconds. We already talked about that. He left 3 cartridges nearly side by side in the firing nest, wiped the rifle clean of fingerprints, stashed the rifle on the other side of the loft before sprinting down 5 flights of stairs, past witnesses who never saw him, and show up cool and calm on the second floor in front of Patrolman Baker about 90 seconds later. And the movie summarizes all of this. In that summary, at least as far as the movie is concerned, it makes sense to be like, well, how this seems silly to think that this person would be able to do all of this. Is there any truth to that whole theory of with Oswald there?
No, there's none. It surprises me to this very day and continues to blow my mind that Garrison proceeded with this trial with nothing but this meaningless pile of circumstantial evidence from eyewitnesses. Eyewitness testimonies are notoriously unreliable. And yeah, you might be able to dig up somebody that says they saw nobody there, but you might also have somebody that saw somebody there. And yeah, if you want to make that timeline seem impossible, you can probably make it seem impossible by tightening or focusing your examining light on it. My point is this. So you've got a guy that was eating his chicken and said, there's nobody up there. You have an officer that says, yeah, I saw him in the room. There wouldn't have been any time. What do those details mean? Do those details tell us anything about the supposed government conspiracy involving the intelligence agencies and the military that was a coup d'etat? No. All they tell us is that, yeah, you have a couple of witnesses who provide testimony that doesn't reconcile with the story that we've been presented. That's all that means. When it came time for Garrison to cough up some actual evidence of this supposed coup d'etat, what did he come up with? Nothing. He had no evidence. What did he have? He had possibly some evidence that Clay Shaw used an alias and then lied about it. He had some evidence that maybe Lee Harvey ran very, very quickly down 5 flights of stairs, but he has no evidence of the actual coup d'etat and conspiracy that is supposedly at the heart of this matter. And that's why it's so surprising to me that more people don't recognize that about this film, that people watch the movie. And I mean, you and I have discussed this exact matter before. Because they saw it in a movie, they are automatically inclined to believe it, even though it is a movie. And this movie loves to do nothing more than take things that really happened and then blend in things that didn't with them. To the extent of, I'll even focus that point to a moment that really caught me off guard when I watched it again just the other day. And that is at the very beginning, you have sort of laying out the historical situation and the geopolitics of the era. And then it moves to it's showing some actual historical archival film footage from around Dallas from the day of the assassination. And it's showing footage in Dealey Plaza. And then I actually paused it, went back and watched it a few more times so that I could pick out like, okay, that's actually from 1963. That was a scene that Oliver Stone filmed in Dealey Plaza, where he had actors and actresses that were in costume that were delivering lines of dialogue that people never spoke, and that they are intercut with scenes from 1963 in Dealey Plaza on the day of the assassination. And that's at the outset of the film, first 5 minutes. And it really astonished me because of the way that Oliver Stone, it's not like I'm surprised. It's not like it's the first time that Oliver Stone has done this, but it really surprised me the extent to which, in an unashamed way, he blended truth and fiction, to the point that he filmed in Dealey Plaza. He had a limousine. He had actors playing the 4 people in the limousine and playing the Secret Service agents. He had actors portraying the eyewitnesses. He even had an actor that stood on top of the little plinth where Abraham Zapruder was filming, and they filmed him filming as if he were filming from that plinth on November 22nd, 1963, except that this was done in 1990. It's an historical piece and it's entertainment. And it's really caught me by surprise that here we are 30 years later, and so many of the things that are presented as part of this movie are things that have entered the mainstream, not just to the point of them influencing the complicated American cultural zeitgeist, but to the point where this is what people believe now. Just in a lifetime of being around firearms and involved in firearms, I can tell you for sure what people believe about the assassination rifle, and that is they do not believe it. Why? Because Oliver Stone told them not to believe it. That's why.
I have to admit, there are times where like some of that the mixture of archival and stuff that's recreated, sometimes it is helpful that there are so many great actors in here. I'm like, oh, that's Gary Oldman. That's not real footage. I know that that's just something that they're recreating, right?
Yeah, but I also think that if Stone had gone with a cast that was less star-studded, I believe that it would not have like leaked into the fabric of our being the way this movie did. But I mean, my God, this lineup of actors and actresses is amazing. And they're so good that the movie came across more as a documentary than a theatrical release motion picture that's based on Jim Garrison's novel, which is a novel because it's fantasy. But you get a bunch of really good actors out there that just knock it out of the park, and you love them and you feel an emotional reaction when you see them. Because I felt it the other day when I came on. Well, like when Candy came on, I was like, oh my God, I forgot he was in that. That Planes, Trains, and Automobiles is here at JFK. How awesome is that? And I had my little moment of warm nostalgia about John Candy. And then I had my moments where I was like, guys, Sissy Spacek, really, she's so beautiful, but she's a different kind of beautiful. And it's just, I felt the way that the movie reached in and tugged on my emotions. And that's what it did for all of us. The way that Forrest Gump tugs on emotions, and Forrest Gump is intended to be over the top and ridiculous, and it's intended to be a howler. And this wasn't. People think of this movie as a documentary.
Well, we talked about Oswald's timeline in the building there. There's something else that the movie talks about. It goes on to say that Garrison, I guess in the movie, is saying this, and he's saying he's using this as a way of suggesting, that Oswald is not the only one involved. And it says that he did not leave the building in a way that you would expect someone who just assassinated the president to do. He bought a Coke at a vending machine, simply strolled out of the building, and then returned home where he was seen at 1 p.m. He gets a jacket, his .38 revolver, leaves at 1:04 p.m. And then at some point between 1:10 and 1:15, he murdered a police officer named Tippett about a mile away. Then Oswald goes to a nearby theater, doesn't buy a ticket. Even I think they said it was like a 75-cent ticket, and he had $14 in his pocket, but he didn't buy a ticket. He asked the cashier to call the police, and then a fleet of patrol cars respond and arrest Oswald for the murder of Officer Tippett. And then at this point, everybody already assumes that Oswald is guilty. The next morning, he's charged with JFK's assassination. And then we already talked about Jack Ruby, the nightclub owner, just happened to be able to get in the police building where Oswald was brought out and kills Oswald. Did that happen the way the movie showed it, where Oswald was eventually captured?
The movie only depicts some of that.
Yeah, he's kind of recounting it.
But the Jim Garrison, played by Kevin Costner, version that is it's exposition that's given to the jury, it's not accurate. It's not entirely accurate. Some of it is, but not all of it. The parts of it that to me seem entirely believable. If you just shot somebody and they're going to be looking for you, what are you going to do? Try not to look like you're up to something or you're guilty. He ditched the rifle, strolled out, tried to look as nonchalant as possible. It's the oldest line in the book. Here comes the boss. Everybody look busy. And he tried to look harmless and like he wasn't up to anything. But at the same time, part of what was motivating him to do what he did was that he wanted that attention. He wanted he wanted cameras on him. Why did you do it, Lee? And he wanted to use this crime as an opportunity to just let all of the insanity in his head sort of gush out. So, yeah, he left through the front door. That doesn't mean anything. That's not evidence that there was a coup d'etat led by the intelligence services and the U.S. military. You can filibuster just about anything to a point where it seems unbelievable. You can pick apart a timeline and make it sound like only someone with superhuman strength could dash from the 6th floor down to the 2nd, this many seconds. It's possible. And a good prosecutor or defense attorney can sell just about anything. And that's what Jim Garrison was doing in that section where he's presenting to the jury, and he's making the jury doubt the timeline of Lee Harvey Oswald firing from the 6th floor, then being seen on the 2nd floor, and then leaving the building and going across town to get his jacket and then go to the movie theater. You can make it sound suspicious that he had $14 in his pocket and he didn't pay for a 75-cent movie ticket. You can weave all of that. And that's why I think this makes a great courtroom drama, but not a great documentary, because what we're seeing is what Jim Garrison wanted us to see. We're thinking what Jim Garrison wanted us to think. And what Jim Garrison wanted us to think was this was a government conspiracy. None of it adds up. None of it makes sense. Absolutely everything has to be doubted because none of it can be reconciled with what actually happened. And I argue that this is the kind of movie that Oliver Stone makes. I think this is the only kind of movie that Oliver Stone makes.
He's good at it.
He's damn good at it, because I tell you what, Platoon kicks ass. That movie is awesome. And that is the biggest smoldering pile of nonsense I've ever sat through in my life. Instead of a magnificent movie, and Platoon, I think, is excellence in filmmaking, and it serves up the same disillusionment and cynicism that JFK serves up. That's what Oliver Stone makes. I think Oliver Stone was capitalizing on a type of a theme of storytelling that was very popular at the time. And what was popular back in the late 80s, early 90s was we're still suffering from what happened to Vietnam. We can't believe it happened to us. The American experience is one that seems to have taken a turn. We seem to be going uphill until we crashed, we collided with Vietnam, and now look where we are. Because if anything, let's just face it, the movie JFK is an anti-Vietnam movie. It's a courtroom drama. The conclusion, which is we weren't going to go to Vietnam, but then they killed this guy, and a bunch of other people made us go to Vietnam. So it's more of Oliver Stone lecturing us about how bad he thinks Vietnam was. And he served in combat in Vietnam, so he would know how bad it was. But at the same time, I think we have to remember that JFK, the movie, and the movie Platoon, they are serving a very specific set of political beliefs. The way that if you turn on Fox News, or if you turn on CNN, or if you turn on certain other reporting agencies, you're going to get one side of the story. That's not to say that JFK is a bad movie, because it's not. It's a great movie, and I loved every minute of it. I couldn't believe that it kept me all the way through more than 3 hours, but it did. And I've watched it so many times I can't count. But it is Oliver Stone filibustering the JFK assassination through the lens of Jim Garrison.
So did Oswald actually kill Officer Tippit then? And then that was kind of what led to him being arrested?
That's what led to his arrest. Yeah. He encountered Tippit. Tippit was listening to an APB, or rather Tippit had heard an APB. Tippit, by the way, World War II veteran, U.S. Army airborne veteran who jumped in Operation Varsity, the largest airborne operation of World War II, as a rifleman in the 517th Parachute Infantry Regiment, 17th Airborne Division. But Tippit was responding to an all-points bulletin that called out to be on the lookout for an adult male matching Lee Harvey Oswald's appearance. And Tippit saw him. He was walking suspiciously, if that's even possible. But Tippit called him over, and they had a confrontation. Lee Harvey didn't want to stop. I believe it's because Lee Harvey knew that they were looking for him, and he didn't want to get arrested there. He wanted to put on a bigger show. And so he ignored Tippit. Tippit got out of the car, confronted him, and that's when Lee Harvey shot and killed him. So now there's 2 APBs out, one for the president killer, one for the cop killer. And they track him down and eventually bring him in response to pursuing the person that shot J.D. Tippit.
And then something else that Garrison throws in there, I remember from the movie, he throws in to tell his side of the story, basically, of that, to lend it to that Oswald was the one that they decided to pin it all on, is that right away, like they had the description of who he was, and right away they had this information about who Oswald was. Did they know pretty much right away that he was involved in the JFK assassination?
Well, they certainly did after he shot a cop. And there is not a significant amount of time that elapses between the two events. They had an idea of who to be on the lookout for, and there were a few people that claimed to have seen somebody. And this is at a town that, just imagine the lockdown, that basically anybody who was out on the street would have been a suspect. And then in the middle, initially rolling out that dragnet, this police officer gets shot and killed. And I know we're not supposed to rush judgment over such things, but if I had been there then, and we're looking for a man that might have shot the president, and suddenly a police officer gets shot, I'd go, yeah, well, this might be our guy. I mean, that's not blind jurisprudence, but that is sort of how law enforcement works. So much can be made of this idea, once again, through the voice of the good salesman, can filibuster just about anything and make you doubt everything. You can be led into considering the possibility that, isn't it convenient that they had his description so quickly? Yeah, well, that day, a lot of things happened very quickly that day. And rather than, what we don't see is rebuttal arguments and closing arguments from the defendant's attorney. We're not saying that. That's not the part that everybody wants to remember. What everybody wants to remember is the show trial. And the show trial, let's face it was a one-man show, and that was Jim Garrison. And so we get Jim Garrison's long, self-indulgent closing argument. We get his ongoing filibuster of each and every little detail about everything from timing to to go downstairs, and timing to get across town, and timing for the APB. We get the way he picks apart everything. And also what I think is missing from the courtroom drama aspect of this movie is what must have felt to everyone in the room, like the absurdity of, like, well, why are you sitting here walking us through step by step what this guy who's been dead for a few years did, when this living guy who's sitting right there is on trial and wasn't in the city where the president was killed. And maybe he had a relationship, but we're waiting for you to try to prove that relationship. And all you have managed to give us so far is some hearsay evidence of people that say that they saw them at a party together. It's all hearsay, and it's inadmissible.
Yeah, that's a good point that he's focusing on Oswald, on the assassination there. But yeah, we need to remember, even in the movie, the trial is about this guy, Clay Shaw, right here.
And he comes up with this wild idea of this coup d'etat. I mean, granted, this is only 6 years after the assassination itself. Yeah. But not quite 6 years, but he's coming up with these ideas of this coup d'etat, and the coup d'etat provides the linkage to Clay Shaw, the person that he's attempting to convict. And he offered absolutely no evidence connecting Clay Shaw to that crime. Absolutely no evidence. A whole bunch of hearsay evidence is offered up. A whole bunch of circumstantial evidence is offered up. But this doesn't mean anything in a trial. These are inadmissible and therefore irrelevant facts. And to the people in the courtroom, I've met a few people in that courtroom, and the ones that I've met were like, we were just all sitting there going, what the hell's going on here? Why is this guy going on and on and on and on about Lee Harvey Oswald and everywhere he went that day? Clay Shaw is the one that's on trial, and you have offered no evidence to connect him to this crime. And I don't believe there was any evidence. And I also been around some paranoid schizophrenics in my life, and they're the ones that very quickly will say, look, my offices have been bugged. which is, of course, a part of this story. We never find out who it is that supposedly bugged him, but we're left with this vague idea, this hovering, lingering threat that the government bugged the offices and they're watching us. What does that serve to the mind of the paranoid schizophrenic? Well, it elevates them to the level of consequentiality to which they want to be elevated, because they don't understand the world. They don't understand just how meaningless and inconsequential they are in a big, scary world, and they can't cope with it. That's the nature of that mental illness. And I believe that Jim Garrison suffered from it just like Lee Harvey Oswald did. And also Dave Ferry.
You mentioned the coup d'etat that he tries to do. And we also talked earlier about Donald Sutherland's character. He's just X in the movie, right? He doesn't give his own name. And that's how Garrison gets the whole conspiracy. And the impression I got from the movie, at least, was this is probably somebody that the movie's putting in to just explain to us how all of this can tie together. Do we know if Garrison had any sort of informant like that, or like a deep throat type guy or anything?
Yeah. Old Garrison talked a lot about people that he never offered proof of, just for the record. And you didn't ask me for my opinion, but my opinion is that Garrison would quickly lie if he didn't have facts that would support whatever argument he was in the middle of. He told stories of informants that came to him and whispered this or that. But at the end of the day, he could provide no proof of any of it. He could not offer up a single scratch of evidence. He could not put a single person on the witness stand who could testify, yes, there was a conspiracy. I was in it. He was in it. He was in it. We were all there together. He couldn't come up with that. What could he come up with? He could come up with a bunch of these loose theories that were based on circumstantial evidence. Circumstantial evidence like when the investigation began, Dave Ferry over and over again said, no, I never knew Lee Harvey Oswald, never met him, never knew him. And then eventually photographs emerge that show Dave Ferry in the same photo with Lee Harvey Oswald, a very young Lee Harvey Oswald, but nevertheless, Lee Harvey Oswald. And all that does is throw enough doubt onto the table that you can go, well, if that's not true, what is true? Is any of this true? That we can, on the basis of a photograph, disassemble an entire narrative. And the reality was that it was popular to doubt the government back then. I remember it was a very, very popular thing. It was very chic and in fashion to suspect the government's lying on anything. And like there's a person that ultimately makes a bit of a name for himself within the world of the conspiracy theory for JFK and all these other conspiracy theories. You know, this guy, Jim Mars, who's now no longer with us. He's no longer alive, but he's an award-winning author that wrote about the Kennedy assassination. And I remember I watched a lot of Jim Mars presentations at these Kennedy assassination, like they have these annual conventions, and I would listen to the proceedings. I never went to one, but I would listen to all of them. And I listened to Jim Mars, who was like the featured speaker at one shortly before his death. And a point I often make about people that are all in on the conspiracy theories is that they're not all in on just one. They won't just go, yeah, Kennedy, that was a coup d'etat led by the government. I don't believe anything about September 11th or any of these other conspiracies. They're in on all of them. And so this guy, Jim Mars, was speaking to the JFK convention. And in it, he began talking about the Anunnaki and how aliens from outer space come down and provided the technology that allowed the construction of the pyramids, and that the Anunnaki were descended from this group of people that came down from space. And I just couldn't help but sort of recoil at this idea of like, wow, so you're not just all in on coup d'etat Kennedy assassination, but we're also talking about aliens now? And I'm not meaning this to sound like I'm lampooning these ideas, but what I'm meaning to do here is to say that there are people that I believe so desperately want all of these things to exist that they dive all in on absolutely everything. Like, do you remember the documentary Loose Change that came out shortly after September 11th?
No, I don't. I mean, it may have been one that I saw, but don't remember.
Yeah, it was made by a group of young guys that believe the exact same thing about September 11th that Jim Garrison and so many other people believe about the Kennedy assassination. And their argument was that September 11th was used so that the military defense establishment could then use the terrorist attack as an excuse to project American strength beyond our borders, to project American strength to far off distant places like Iraq and Afghanistan, to make war, to expand the military industrial complex for defense contractors like Halliburton, Kellogg, Brown and Root, who was mentioned in the movie JFK, by the way, and all of these government contractors to become rich off of this war that was built on hyped up ideas. And it was bizarre to me when it came out was the idea that a coup d'etat was there so that we could make war against Iraq and Afghanistan. They kind of quickly went away, and you don't hear much about that documentary now, especially when, after 8 years, George W. Bush ceased to be president of the United States of America as a result of free, open, multi-party democratic elections that led to the peaceful transition of power to the opposing political party. And I find that they just love to spin up their conspiracy theories until that happens. And then suddenly you don't hear so much from them. You're not hearing from them because if it was a coup d'etat, why didn't we have a Pinochet or a Francisco Franco? If there was a coup d'etat, where is the solitary authoritarian leader who emerges that runs everything? Where's the Vladimir Putin in all of this? Am I to understand that Lyndon Baines Johnson was our Vladimir Putin? And if so, why did he decide he didn't want to be president anymore in 1968? And why did the opposing political party get their man into office the following year? The point in bringing it up, I'm saying that if it was a conspiracy theory, a conspiracy to do what? Declare war in Vietnam? Well, that's something that eventually did happen. Yeah. But that doesn't mean that you're right. Just because we ultimately then, with Johnson in control, with Johnson at the White House working with McNamara, and moving beyond 1963, he makes policy decisions that are a little different than what President Kennedy probably would have made. But that doesn't prove that there was a conspiracy. They will then argue that because they had the opportunity to destroy all of the evidence of that conspiracy. And I was like, so then did Johnson lead this conspiracy only for a set number of years? Because what it looks like is what we got out of him was 5 years. Was he like, all right, I'm going to take over the country, but only for 5 years. And then I'm going to step down because I will have become annoyed with having to answer to the free press all the time. It doesn't feel very much like a coup d'etat to me. I know that Oliver Stone wants us to see that. And I know that Oliver Stone wants it to look like there was a fiendish plot that made him eventually go to Vietnam. But I don't think it was a fiendish plot. I think it was a group of people who approached the idea of taking the American nation to war. They approached it with a great deal of sobriety, and they imagined a war in which we would prevail. And then they got there and started fighting it, and we weren't prevailing as quickly as they liked. And the free press was saying bad things about that war and the way we were prosecuting it. It doesn't look like a coup d'etat. What it looks like is a government that's populated with human beings. And as long as it's populated by human beings, there are going to be mistakes made. So that the world that I'm presenting, which is very much different than Oliver Stone's world, is a world in which Lee Harvey Oswald is a narcissistic high school dropout, paranoid schizophrenic who has delusions of grandeur. And the perfect opportunity drops in his lap when he reads the Dallas Morning Times and it advertised the presidential motorcade route. And he decided that he would throw the wild entropy into the system that he did by carrying off this assassination, which was he was easily capable of doing because he was an experienced Marine rifleman. He had a firearm that was a very, very effective infantry military firearm. And he was able to deliver 3 shots in the amount of time that the movie says. I think there was even more time between shots, but it can even be done in 5.6 seconds. And that then a president who had a little bit of a different outlook about the foreign policy course of the nation took over. They love to call attention to ideas like LBJ was waiting in the wings. LBJ immediately had himself sworn in, and that they wanted to do it right then and there. They quickly call attention to the fact that everything happened rapidly. And my first thought is, of course it did, because that's the succession of power for a nuclear capable nation. There will definitely be a swift and clear cut succession and transition of power to the person that power is supposed to go to, the vice president. They will use that as evidence of there having been a coup d'etat. And to me, it doesn't seem like it. That's definitely what has to happen in the event that a president is assassinated, because someone has to have the launch codes, and someone has to have the launch codes and all the responsibilities that are associated with them, and they have to have them immediately.
Are you talking about the shots again? And there, and I want to go back to the movie to talk about something that Jim Garrison talks about in the trial, the magic bullet. And Garrison says it was accepted by the Warren Commission report. And I'll give the movie's explanation for how it explains the magic bullet. It says that there were 3 shots. One of them, or a fragment of one of them, hit a man named James Tague, who was standing near the triple underpass. He was the 3rd wounded man, a bystander who was basically at the wrong place, wrong time. Thankfully, it was a superficial wound, but we know that had one of the bullets, basically. And then one of the bullets was the fatal headshot that killed Kennedy. And so the theory here is that means there's one bullet left that had to have caused the remaining 7 wounds on Kennedy and Connolly. And this is where Jim Garrison's character explains the theory, the magic bullet theory. And I'm just going to pull this direct quote, if you'll let me, just direct quote from the movie. I paused it to quote this. It says, "The magic bullet enters the president's back, headed downward at an angle of 17 degrees. It then moves upward in order to leave Kennedy's body from the front of his neck, wound number 2, where it waits 1.6 seconds, presumably in midair, where it turns right, then left, continues into Connolly's body at the rear of his right armpit, wound number 3. The bullet then heads downward at an angle of 27 degrees, shattering Connolly's 5th rib and exiting from the right side of his chest, wound number 4. The bullet then turns right and re-enters Connolly's body at his right wrist, wound number 5, shattering the radius bone. The bullet exits Connolly's wrist, wound number 6, makes a dramatic U-turn and buries itself into Connolly's left thigh, wound number 7, from which it later falls out and is found in almost pristine condition on a stretcher in a corridor in Parkland Hospital." So that's how the movie describes this magic bullet theory. I guess my question about this is kind of a 2-parter. Is the magic bullet theory really something that, according to the movie, it's recommended that the Warren Commission used it in their report? Also, it seems kind of silly, but how plausible is that theory?
It's completely implausible, because the magic bullet nonsense failed to account for the fact that the president and the governor were not seated in tandem perfectly. The president was in a jump seat that was lower than Governor Connolly's seat, and then the president was slightly outboard of Governor Connolly within the vehicle. In addition to that, Governor Connolly had turned and was talking to the president over his right shoulder. Ironically, because there were some crowds out, Governor Connolly apparently was saying to the president, "See, Mr. President, Dallas does love you," because he had some concerns that there were some big opponents of the Kennedy administration in the city. And ironically, he said that ironically shortly before the fire opened up, so that when the thoracic cavity wound hits the president in his back, it exits in his throat. It then travels straight in a perfectly straight line forward and strikes Governor Connolly, who once again is sitting slightly inboard from the president, and he's also speaking over his right shoulder. It strikes him, passes through his body, is deflected off of the bone, and then lodges in his arm. And when you account for the fact that the 2 men were not perfectly in tandem, but were offset from one another, the trajectory of the bullet lines up perfect, and there's nothing magic going on at all. But if you're Jim Garrison and you want to introduce the shadow of a doubt, what are you going to do? You're going to make it sound. You're going to go to the absurd lengths to make it sound like this can't possibly be true. And the movie depicts it in this powerful graphic way, in that he has two members of the DA's office support team sitting perfectly tandem from one another, just like that. And he's using a pointer, and he's sarcastically and ridiculously exaggerating. And it makes this turn, it makes that turn, and it passes through. Frequently pauses while it collects its thoughts and this is the perfect example of the way that Jim Garrison deliberately filibustered this idea, that he was purposely hunting for and on the lookout for any detail that he could call critical attention to. And if you imagine the two men sitting in tandem, the magic bullet theory seems like an absurdity. If you picture them sitting as they actually were, it's not. Another big issue that comes up within the context of the movie just a few months later is it was a lingering thing. And in fact, it was sort of the big takeaway people took away from the movie after it came out, the whole up and to the left, up and to the left. He repeats it several times in the movie, to the point that there was a Seinfeld episode that satirized up and to the left, up and to the left. And up and to the left was intended to call critical attention to the idea of, if it's a single shooter and it's Lee Harvey Oswald and he's on the 6th floor of the Texas School Book Depository building, the shots will be coming from behind the president. And by calling attention to up and to the left, he's inviting everyone to consider that the headshot couldn't have come from behind. It had to come from in front of him, which is the only big evidentiary weakness to the single shooter idea, in my opinion. But Jim Garrison didn't stop and pause and feel an obligation to say to the jury, I should tell you, by the way, that the men weren't sitting in tandem to one another. They were offset. And I should also tell you, by the way, that the part of the reason that the president's body reacts up and to the left and then he collapses down to the left is, that day, the president was wearing his back brace. So the president's torso is braced. So there are certain ways that man's body would not move. And because of his back brace, he's not going to slack back as a result of a bullet. His body is going to behave different than someone who's not encumbered by a brace. And so if the headshot, if a single shooter is what happened, and the headshot came from behind instead of in front, that headshot, which was a glancing blow, it was not a direct hit, but a glancing blow that hit here with the president's body confined within his back brace, he's not going to slash forward like he would expected to as a result of a shot coming from behind. Body's going to behave differently. And I think what we see is a body that is locked into a back brace, and he was already slumped over a little to the left as it was and favoring the left, and the bullet hits a glancing blow. His body is reacting within his back brace, and then he slumps over left because there's structure of the vehicle on the right side. He's not going to slump over to the right because there's the vehicle there. The only thing between him and the first lady at that point was the empty part of the back seat. And so he slumps over to the left. So his body doesn't behave perfectly like Jim Garrison wants it to behave. And his body does behave perfectly like Jim Garrison wants it to behave, because he wants it to look like he's shot from in front. Because then if there's a shot coming from in front of him, that means, the grassy knoll, that's true. That means that there were multiple shooters. This was an ambush set up by multiple shooters operating and as a part of a coherent plan in concert with one another. And that means that the first shooter on the 6th floor delivered his shots, and the grassy knoll delivered this kill shot. And so it gives Jim Garrison what he wants. Jim Garrison had to have known that the president was in a back brace. He just doesn't mention it. And Oliver Stone doesn't mention it either.
I don't ever remember that being mentioned. That seems like that would be something with the level of detail that they're going to, like, talking about the people that saw Oswald one of the guys that goes to the detail of, oh, he was eating his chicken dinner, right? Or like that, or chicken lunch or whatever, that level of detail. Yeah, you would think, the president wearing a back brace and having that, how it affects what his body does, that would be a pretty big thing to leave out.
And but it's a rhetorical technique. It's a debate technique to, in fact, I know I bored you by sending you the Wikipedia link before this started, but it's the Gish Gallop. It's the idea that you dump all this information on your opponent to make it look like I control it all. I know everything. You don't know nearly as much as I know because I know everything. And by dumping certain what seem like meaningless details, you might have the effect of making the jury think, my God, this guy sure does seem to know everything.
Yeah.
You dump details in areas where you have them, and then you just conveniently skip over areas that weaken your argument. And this concept of the Gish Gallop, which originates from the debate about intelligent design and evolution, was this man Gish who the way that he would approach debating anybody that was pro-evolution was he would just bombard them with absurd statements and with statements that were definitely incorrect. And he would just bombard, he'd put out so much information that your immediate instinct would begin, your instinct would kick in to begin a process of responding. And if you dump so much on your opponent, that gives the opponent so much of the momentum because now you're just responding. You're not on the attack. You're not carrying the football. You're forced into a position of having to respond. Like, first of all, the first thing you said was absurd. And here's why. And second of all, and you'll burn all your time responding to absurdities. And it's a great way of deflecting where your opponent might have some strength. It's a standard rhetorical technique. And Jim Garrison, just to show you, he was an emotionally ill person, but he wasn't insane because he possessed the mental faculties to understand how you lean into where you have strengths and you avoid areas where you're weak. And so that's why little details like back brace and the orientation of the seats in the limousine, that's why just gloss over those. But what do you do instead? You put on this big melodramatic, bombastic show about a magic bullet where you put two people there and you sarcastically talk your way through something that actually makes a lot of sense. And that will get a jury to sway in your favor. That's why he did what he did. And the movie, it's so curious to me because I remember at the time the movie came out, I was already aware of the evidence that was out there about the non-tandem seating arrangement. I was already aware of the governor talking over his right shoulder to the president. I was already aware that those men weren't squared off one in front of the other. And yet the magic bullet thing comes out and it just created a generation of Americans who believed that the Warren Commission was populated by people who were either idiots or people who were in on it. And I believe that lingers to this day.
Well, you mentioned the grassy knoll, and they do talk about that in the movie. And of course, I have to ask about the grassy knoll. We're talking about JFK. And in the movie, again, this is Garrison. A lot of this is, Garrison recounting things, as you said, as monologues, right? We don't see a lot of it, but he talks about how there were 51 witnesses that thought they heard shots coming from the grassy knoll. And some other key witnesses had absolutely no doubt that one or more shot came from behind the picket fence. Were there actually witnesses that saw something from the grassy knoll or from some area other than the book depository?
Yes, but they didn't see another shooter. We have circumstantial evidence that was presented at Warren Commission about people hearing things. An obvious explanation that hardly even needs to be mentioned is that, well, you're going to get a lot of buildings slapped back in a downtown urban environment where there are a lot of structures that are going to cause sound to bounce in curious ways. There were people that specifically remembered the sound of gunfire coming from in front of them. But there were also people that specifically remembered the sound of gunfire coming from behind and above in the direction of the school book depository. So there are irreconcilable personal accounts from the crime scene. And that brings up another subject that would be wrong for us to ignore. And that is this idea that the idea of the eyewitness account being infallible. Eyewitness accounts are not nearly as trustworthy as we like to imagine them. The idea of the person that's going to say, I was there, I saw it, and here's what I saw, and that is going to be a 100% reliable account.
Especially years later, as the movie admits it, Garrison is doing this investigation years after the event. So people are recalling things. It wasn't like fresh on their memory.
Right. And the human memory is a perishable item. We have a shelf life. Our brains have a shelf life. And that shelf life begins a process of timing out. And so just as a result of the natural operation of the aging of the human body, we will begin to lose data. Then, in addition to that, humans are emotional animals. Humans are emotional animals that will change their story with the passage of time. I worked for a period of a decade where all I did was record personal accounts from veterans of the Second World War. And there were plenty of personal accounts that came from World War II veterans who were either lying or they remembered everything incorrectly. They're doing the same thing years later, trying to recall an event that was a sudden frantic event where a lot of things happened very quickly. And I found that some people were pretty good reporters and some were unreliable. So if you pull everyone in that was there and you interview every last one of them, you're going to have some variations in the form of the story. This is something that in a trial situation, they take into account. They take into account the fact that the human eyewitness is not completely reliable at all times. And again, this was not really something that was a part of the trial of Clay Shaw, who remembered hearing what at Dealey Plaza. Clay Shaw wasn't even in Texas that day. And yet it's being played out because Jim Garrison wanted it all out, because Jim Garrison wanted a stage and a microphone and he wanted some attention, because he was notorious for being this flamboyant district attorney that went ahead full speed ahead on prosecutions, even when he didn't have evidence. He was notorious for that even before the trial of Clay Shaw. And so here he is pulling in, and what is he doing? He is curating the eyewitnesses that tell the story that he wants told. He is excluding the eyewitnesses that tell the story that he does not want told. And in this way, he makes it look like everybody that was there that day remembers a shot coming from in front of the president on the grassy knoll. Just because you have a couple of people that are willing to testify that they heard a gunshot coming from that direction doesn't mean it actually happened. And in a proper trial setting, that kind of evidence would be weighted in a different way. It would be a trial as a matter of fact. It would be a fact for the jury to consider. And the jury, in considering that, would consider the veracity, the believability of that witness. That person would come, swear the oath, sit there and tell the story. And the jury would then decide whether or not that person was believable. And with this case, that's all Garrison had. Garrison went forward with an attempt to prosecute this man for being involved in the murder of a president. And he had literally, I'm not exaggerating, he had no direct evidence. He had some really iffy personal accounts and circumstantial evidence. And that's all. And that's why he didn't get a conviction. So yeah, there were people that testified to hearing a gunshot in front of the motorcade in the area of the so-called grassy knoll, which was sort of the central idea of the multiple shooters scenario. And to this day, no proof has been revealed that show that there were definitely people there that were shooting. Yet the movie makes a big deal about the man who was sort of the traffic control officer for the railroad marshaling yard that's there with the oak masses of Elm Street. And they had him, and what was he testifying to? He testified to seeing some people that looked like vagrants that were hovering around this one fence. Or they drove in, they drove out of the parking lot, and that was suspicious. And then he saw the suspicious characters there, and that's one person. And maybe he saw an assassin, but it doesn't look like he did. And if he did, maybe somebody got away with it. that the grassy knoll issue becomes sort of the central issue of this movie, because if there was a shot that came from the grassy knoll, that definitely means there was more than one shooter. And if there was more than one shooter, that definitely means that there was a conspiracy. And if there was a conspiracy, that definitely means that there was a coup d'etat. That's how the Jim Garrison line of thinking went. It was a very survivor bias type way of thinking, a confirmation bias way of thinking. And he was not successful in convincing the jury that this is what happened. I'm sorry, that jury very quickly decided there was no evidence here. This trial is a waste of time.
Yeah, as you're saying that, I didn't think about this before, but obviously witness testimony is suspect, like we've been talking about, but also too, we're talking about with Garrison, and if he's known for wanting to be in the public eye, like be in the spotlight and kind of have there too. The same sort of thing could be true for some of the witnesses who were there, who, saw the president get assassinated, and now all of this stuff is coming in. I mean, I have to imagine that some people would have their 15 minutes of fame or whatever, and kind of remember things in a way that may not be entirely accurate. I don't know. Some people want to just go ahead and lie about things, sure, but some people will be like, oh yeah, I remember that. Sure, yeah, I remember that, because it kind of helps them too,
I lose track of the way that people listening to you and paying attention to you can be intoxicating. I have seen it professionally many, many times. There's one case that I've been dealing with for a little over a decade now, and it's this famous moment from the movie The Longest Day, where this actor, Red Buttons, portraying a man named John Steele, comes down by parachute and snags on the church tower of the church in the village of St. Mary Louise. I have beliefs about that, but that's not the reason I'm mentioning the story. What I am definitely going to say, though, is that John Steele told his story. And the way that he told the story was that he snagged on the bell tower and he was there for an hour. They took him down. He was then a prisoner. And in his own words, he describes how before the sun came up, he was a prisoner being held by the Germans. What then really confused me was how I came up with multiple other individuals who came forward who said, I saw him hanging from the church tower. And in two examples, one of them is 2 days later and one of them is 4 days later, 4 days after D-Day. And these examples, they fascinate me because they do not reconcile with what John Steele himself said. Because according to him, he was up there for about an hour, maybe 2 hours. And yet there's somebody who said 4 days later, I came through that town, St. Mary Louise, and I saw that guy hanging from the church steeple. Why would that? That's clearly not the case. That's definitely not the case. And I know that's not the case because at about 10 a.m. on D-Day, an airplane flew over St. Mary Louise and took photos of that church, and there was nobody hanging there by 10 a.m. And so there definitely was nobody hanging there 4 days later. And yet this guy was saying that.
Yeah, I remember we talked about that when we did cover The Longest Day. I remember you talking about that, and it's on a much smaller scale, perhaps in this movie in JFK with witnesses doing that. And I'm just speculating. I have absolutely no idea whether or not witnesses would have done that kind of thing, but it's plausible that somebody could do that or might even want to do something like that to be in the spotlight.
We cannot overlook the fact that people will deliberately misrepresent and distort facts just for the purposes of having a microphone put in front of them or a camera that turns on to them. It's intoxicating to be the center of attention. And there are people who will change the story of what they actually saw just so that they get some attention from it. I would be wrong to not suspect that that would be at work in the JFK assassination. And I think it is at work here in some cases because people begin coming forward and telling these stories. Can I just mention one example? A few minutes ago, I told the story of Dr. Mary's monkey. And Dr. Mary's monkey was this this idea that Lee Harvey Oswald was a CIA operative that was assigned to protect Dr. Mary Sherman. Then, because of a mistake in an accident in a laboratory, he was supposed to kill her and clean up and make it look like somebody broke into her apartment and killed her. Well, a woman ultimately publishes a book that's called Me and Lee, in which she's telling the story of how she was Dr. Mary Sherman's lab assistant, and she had a torrid love affair with Lee Harvey Oswald while he was protecting Dr. Mary Sherman. And this is a book that a woman has actually written. She's still alive, and she goes to these symposia events that they have, and she tells the story over and over again. And that story fascinates me. I'm going to read you the actual name of the book because the name sort of says it all.
Coincidentally, she makes a living off of that now, huh?
Of course. I mean, I think you've put your finger on the operative situation. The book is by Judith Baker, and it's titled Me and Lee, How I Can Know, Love, and Lose Lee Harvey Oswald.
Huh.
And that book is built on the narrative that was established in the book Dr. Mary's Monkey. Is any of it true? These authors would have us believe that Lee Harvey Oswald was this secret CIA agent working in New Orleans protecting this doctor that was doing this work on the perfect supervirus, and that he then was involved in trying to cover up the lab accident that killed her, and that he had a love affair with this woman. Maybe you can tell by my tone that I'm a little reluctant to believe all of this. It's just that I've had too many experiences in my life where I weighed a personal account. I gave it a little bit too much weight. I gave it a little bit too much believability. I was willing to accept a personal account when I should have been suspicious of it. And what it has turned me into is somebody that is suspicious of personal accounts. And I kind of treat it as a case-by-case basis, whether or not the person seems believable, because people can tell stories that are false and they can believe themselves. But this is a part of the frailty of the human mind and a part of the frailty of the complex social behaviors that human beings exhibit. And among that complexity are cases where people will speak a mistruth simply because they are getting attention in ways that they had never gotten before. Simply because by telling this story, suddenly they're consequential when people are coming to speak to them and they're on the news, or maybe they're being talked about on the radio. They will stretch and bend the truth just so that they continue receiving that attention.
Yeah. Especially in the case for somebody like Jim Garrison being in politics. Politicians are pretty good at that kind of thing, because that helps them in the next, whatever the next thing is that they're going to be doing.
Yeah. And in a surprising way, I find even here in the 21st century Thunderdome, where there's an internet and social media, and you can conduct immediate fact checking of everything. Even today, I find that there are people who are kind of willing to buy things hook, line, and sinker. And that surprises me, because I would think that they're doing exactly what I'm doing, which is get the phone out, tap, 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 tap. That's not true, because right here it says wrong. But there are people that will do that, even here in this day and age. And so certainly in 1963, there were crowds of people that they had nothing else to go on. That's this whole, the Brandolini principle, this idea that BS is so much more challenging to refute than it is establish. It's very easy to BS something into existence, and it's very difficult to empirically disassemble it. For that reason, we see a lot of people out there that are willing to BS their way into prominence. Like the case that I think continues to surprise me most was, I think it was 2012, but there was a kid on American Idol, and he was one of the featured people that they profiled on American Idol. And his big claim to fame was that his quote was, "I was blown up in Afghanistan." And that when the broadcast went on the air, during which he's being profiled, within minutes, all these other people were coming forward going, I remember that kid from Afghanistan. He never got blown up. He never went outside the wire. He was never on a patrol. He never suffered an injury. That guy purposely overdosed on acne medicine because then it would get you medically evacuated back to Germany. Because only in Germany at Landstuhl Air Force Base, they have the medical facility that could deal with you after you overdose from that medicine. And so it was proof to me that the 20th century information Thunderdome has changed everything. But then I was more curious about this kid who was in his 20s, who put the lie out there to begin with. And I think it was because he got used to a world where he would say, oh, yeah, I got blown up in Afghanistan, and everyone would immediately believe him. No one would suspect him. And it's just that when it was broadcast television, people could start using the internet, they could start coming out and pointing out the problems with the story. But this kid still put the false story out there. And I guess that allure of being the center of attention and being consequential for people who are inconsequential, that allure is so great that they're willing to take the chance.
And it's supposed to be something where somebody like Jim Garrison is supposed to be the one that is doing the fact checking and not being the one to put it out there. Near the end of the movie, though, I do want to know the end of the movie, they kind of summarize it all. And we've talked about a lot of the depth there, but I want to summarize what the movie says is Jim Garrison's overall theory for what happened that day. He says it started at 12:15. There was an epileptic seizure that distracted the police to allow the shooters to get into their places. He notes that the epileptic later vanished, never checked into the hospital. And then we kind of talked about it. He's put forward the theory that there are three teams. So there's the A team that got on the 6th floor of the depository, moved into position just minutes before the shooting. The B team, one rifleman, one spotter with the headset, access to the building, moves into the low floor of the Daltex building. The C team moves in behind the picket fence above the grassy knoll where shooter and spotter are seen by the late Lee Bowers and the watchtower of the rail yard. We talked about that. 2 or 3 more men are in the crowd on Elm, 10 to 12 men overall, 3 teams, 3 shooters. And they don't shoot Kennedy coming up Houston Street, which would have been the easiest shot for a single shooter in Book Depository. But they wait until he gets into the kill zone with 3 rifles, the final turn from Houston onto Elm. Kennedy's car slows down to 11 miles an hour. The first shot misses completely. And he's talking about frames, which in the movie we can see showing like the Zapruder film there. So frame 161, Kennedy stops waving as he hears something. Connolly's head turns slightly to the right. Frame 193, the second shot hits Kennedy in the throat from the front. Frame 225, the president emerging from behind the road sign. We talked about that earlier. You see he's obviously been hit. He's raising arms to his throat. The third shot is frame 232, hits Kennedy in the back, pulling him downward, forward. Connolly, in the movie, Garrison says, Connolly, you'll notice, shows no sign of being hit. And then frame 238 is the fourth shot, according to Garrison there. It misses Kennedy and takes Connolly in the back. And then around this time, another shot misses the car, strikes James Teague down by the underpass. The car breaks. The sixth and final shot then is frame 313. It takes Kennedy in the head from the front. That's the key shot, according to the movie. And then, as we talked about earlier, President going back into his left, shot from the front. The right, totally inconsistent with the shot from the depository. So that is a bullet point summary of the trial that Jim Garrison had, the testimony in his court as to that there. Was that really what his testimony was, the summary of what his case was?
Yeah, because his case has to necessarily be built on multiple teams for his case to work, for there to have been a grand conspiracy, for there to have been a coup d'etat. The whole assassination has to just be overkill. Because if you think about it, 3 separate shooter teams with all these spotters. If you've been to Dealey Plaza, why the hell you need a spotter? 88 meters from the 6th floor to the headshot. You don't need a spotter for that. You don't need 3 teams for that. You know what you need for that? 1 person with a decent rifle. So, but for Garrison, though, if he's going to get a conviction on Clay Shaw, there has to be a conspiracy, because otherwise Clay Shaw has absolutely nothing to do with this nonsense. And so for Garrison, it has to be Lee Harvey up on the 6th floor, grassy knoll, team 3, God knows where, spotters, completely unnecessary spotters everywhere in the plaza that for whatever reason, they all wait to get a triangulation of fire. Why? When one rifleman can do it all. And technically one rifleman can do it all with one shot. One shot kills Robert Kennedy. One shot from a little 22 caliber revolver. One shot from a 22 caliber revolver almost kills Ronald Reagan, and he didn't even get shot. He caught a ricochet, and it damn near killed him. Why? One shot from Mark David Chapman kills John Lennon. Why? Why to kill John F. Kennedy do we have to have a conspiracy involving more than a dozen people in this highly complicated ambush scenario? But that's what Jim Garrison needs, because he's trying to convict Clay Shaw as he's trying to convict him of being a part of a conspiracy to commit murder. And if he can't prove that there was a conspiracy, he can't get a conviction on Clay Shaw. It went to jury trial, and Jim Garrison was not capable of convincing a jury that there was a conspiracy. And the jury did not believe that Clay Shaw had anything to do with him. When the jury retired to deliberate, they spent a grand total of 50 minutes, which I think also involves their bathroom time. And they came back with a 100% unanimous not guilty. He was acquitted on all counts. And the matter goes away. It goes away so much so that when Jim Garrison writes a book about it in 1988, he doesn't even talk about that trial.
Again, just conveniently not talking about something that didn't fit the narrative.
Just don't even mention it. Jim Garrison, the district attorney who was notorious for throwing charges at people that he couldn't prove, threw charges at Clay Shaw, and he couldn't prove them. And so Clay Shaw was acquitted. But we get one hell of a good movie out of the deal.
That is true. That is true. At the very end of the movie, though, it does talk about him being not guilty, but then it talks about some documents. Garrison mentions 51 CIA documents pertaining to Oswald and Jack Ruby. It's not going to be released until 2038. Then text at the end says in 1979, the man who was director of covert operations in 1963 admitted under oath that Clay Shaw did in fact work for the CIA. It also mentions files of the House Select Committee on Assassinations locked away until 2029. Congressional investigation from 76 to 79 found probable conspiracy and recommended the Justice Department investigate. But then as of 1991, when the movie was released, they hadn't done anything. I know before we actually hit record, we were talking, there were some not new documents necessarily, but more redacted documents. But is the movie correct about these documents that are not released yet? What's kind of the current state of that?
Yeah, we're still waiting for some documents to be released. Just to show you how this isn't a live thing, and what kind of keeps me coming back for more and keeps me interested in it is that every now and then we will get this new haul of documents. The way that classification of documents went was it was typically done as a big blanket, like, oh, we're going to classify everything. And so things would get classified, even though they don't necessarily contain information that is incriminating. You might find a document that's been classified for 25 years, but it's completely unincriminating. It doesn't say anything spicy, but it was classified. Why? Because it was subject of a blanket classification. It's just easier to do it that way. And then you don't have to sit through, if you have a document haul of like 250,000 pages, then you don't have to sit there and go through every single page. You go, we're going to classify all of it just in case. We can't let anything slip out. So there are some documents that are going to come out. Documents were unredacted earlier this year. I was a part of this podcast that talked about it. It was back in April, right after it happened. And it was exciting because it was 12,950 pages that had been released previously, but with redactions. And when you get the pages, they're just blacked out with tape. It looks like magic marker, but they tape over the incriminating parts. And so you know that there's information on that page that you can't see. And the administration authorized their release without the redactions. And so all of these documents that had been out before were functionally released without redactions. And everybody got all spun up and very, very excited about it, me included. And kind of the big takeaway of it was that the FBI was watching Lee Harvey Oswald. And why? And that's because he was making a lot of noise. If he was a CIA agent, he sure was one hell of a sloppy CIA agent by doing things like standing on a street corner in New Orleans in 1962, handing out communist literature and defecting to the Soviet Union. If he was a secret agent, why was he making so much noise? But the FBI was watching it. And he had apparently made some threats against the president. So the documents that were released without redactions earlier this year, they were documents that had been redacted to protect the identities of Secret Service agents and CIA agents and FBI agents. So the information that came out, it was edifying and we learned some things. But in terms of proving whether or not Jim Garrison was right, the documents, they certainly didn't do that. All the documents really did was provide an indication that, yeah, the FBI was watching this goofball because they were worried that he might try something, which he eventually did. So I don't drink, I don't smoke. I'm pretty careful with what I eat because I want to stick around to 2029 and see what this next document production looked like. It's not that far off at this point. I think I can make it. I'm going to start getting more cardio though. But in all seriousness, it will be interesting to see if anything is ultimately released that will blow the case wide open. If we will learn something that will vindicate Jim Garrison. I suspect that we will not. I suspect that he will not be vindicated because my belief is that this conspiracy and that this coup d'etat is fantasy. It's people who want to imagine a more interesting and exciting world than the one that actually exists. Because the world where the narcissistic high school dropout, paranoid schizophrenic with a rifle, the world where that one person can change history, that's not the world I want to live in, because that's a scary place. It's a scary place where one guy can look at the newspaper and go, hey, the president's going to pass right by this building tomorrow. I think I'll kill him. That's a terrifying place to live. Is it more terrifying than the world where the military and the intelligence agencies, they conspire to murder the president? I don't know, but it feels like a very, very dark place where the randomness of the person who is completely undeserving of attention, the person like Lee Harvey Oswald. How many times have I said his name today? 100. I think that would please him. I think he would love the idea that here we are, decades later, still whispering about him, still imagining what his role was, still debating whether or not he was a more consequential person than he really was. That's what he wanted. That's what he was after. The same way that Hinckley was trying to impress Jodie Foster by doing what? By killing a president. We have mentally ill people that walk among us, and they will disproportionately direct ire and hostility toward people who are in positions of leadership, people who enjoy a more prosperous life than they are, people that they're jealous of. They may not admit it deep down inside. They will fabricate reasons to hate the person who's doing better in life than they are. And it's a dark world where these petty dark angels will result in murder. But that's the world we live in. I'm afraid the world we live in is the one where Lee Harvey Oswald is the single shooter. And I'm afraid that the world we don't live in is the one in which there's a conspiracy on the part of intelligence agencies and the military to overthrow a government. I'm afraid that's not what happened that day. I'm afraid it was Lee Harvey Oswald. And certainly when Jim Garrison had his 5 minutes of fame and he could bring to bear the best possible case to crack open the case of who killed President Kennedy, he fell flat on his face. He failed utterly. He did not even manage to convince a jury that Clay Shaw had an alias. And he couldn't convince them of that because he couldn't prove it. And if you can't prove that Clay Shaw operated under an alias, you definitely can't prove his connections to a broad conspiracy. And so Jim Garrison, who assembled the one and only case for murder that has ever been brought forward over the assassination of JFK. And he brought that case forward. What did he get? Unanimous acquittal. I think that speaks more and more profoundly than any of the words I've spoken here today. That shows you that there was no case to begin with. He couldn't convince a jury in New Orleans in 1969. And I don't know that, well, I should say this. Jim Garrison couldn't convince a jury in 1969, but then I think Oliver Stone went on to convince an entire nation in 1991. It's just that I think Oliver Stone was a better attorney than Jim Garrison was. But look at all the tools that were available to Oliver Stone. He had storytelling and movie making tools at his disposal. And he produced something that was very compelling. Even when I watched it just the other day again, it's still a very compelling movie. It's just a shame that most of that's not true.
Well, thank you so much for coming on to chat about JFK. I know we did summarize kind of what Jim Garrison had there at the end, and we've talked about a lot of the details throughout, but I thought before we wrap up, it'd be a great idea for us to do the same thing. So before I let you go, aside from anything that we see in the movie, what do you think really happened at Dealey Plaza on November 22nd, 1963?
I think that a mentally ill individual who had already attempted to assassinate one person secretly brought a rifle to work, knowing that a presidential motorcade would pass the building where he was working, and that he could once and for all make the world stop and pay attention to him by assassinating this person who he felt was a declared enemy of Marxism. I feel like, I believe that Lee Harvey Oswald, acting on his own, he was crazy enough to act on his own through all of this. And that the unfortunate truth behind it all is that you can have a great person like John F. Kennedy. So from no matter what you have to say about his personal life, he was a great American. He was an elected president of the United States of America. He was a World War II combat veteran, and he was wearing a brace that day because of injuries that he had sustained in combat with the enemy during the Second World War, during his service as a naval officer. He was a great American. And I believe that he was turning the country, the ship of state was turning in a far more pragmatic direction, the direction of entering an era of engagement with the Soviet Union that I think would have produced a better future. One that would probably have been a little bit better than the one that we ended up with, which was the one where we have war with Vietnam. And because he seemed soft on the communists, yeah, there were a lot of people that didn't like him. Lee Harvey Oswald, over and over again, tried to get the world to pay attention to him. And the world continued to disappoint Lee Harvey because he imagined much better things for himself than what the world was giving him. Because the world was giving him this sort of mundane, disappointing, and pathetic existence. Because the world doesn't often reward ideologues with very little education. And that's what he was. He was not even, he was an ideologue. He was a ranting and raving extremist with very little education. And the world doesn't stop and listen to people like that very often. So the only way to make a name for yourself is to kill somebody. And that's what he did.
Well, thank you again so much for your time. I know we've talked about a couple movies throughout this that I'm sure you'll be back on, but until then, what have you been working on lately that people can check out?
I just got back from California filming a new series for History Channel called History Unexplained. And tomorrow I fly to New York and I'm going to be filming at History Channel headquarters on yet another series. The one I'm working on tomorrow is with a show host by the name of Dan Aykroyd. He was not in the movie JFK, by the way. The show that I worked on last week, History Unexplained for History Channel, has a show host by the name of William Shatner. But I keep doing television work, and I'm also looking forward to getting back overseas. I just got back from a big long trip to Europe, and I'm heading back next week to Europe to lead some tours to places like the Normandy beaches and Hitler's Eagle's Nest. and I stay busy doing this sort of thing, it sounds like a lot more fun than it actually is. But I continue to lead tours and make television shows. And you'll be interested to know that the show that I made last week in Los Angeles, History on a Plate with William Shatner, they had me talking about the assassination of JFK.
Oh, of course they did. Yeah.
Because this is a subject that will never go away.
Yep, for sure. Yeah. I mean, especially because like you're saying, 2029, more documents coming out, just going to come right back around.
Yeah, we got a big anniversary coming up too. So yeah, the subject's getting pulled back out of the closet. It's going to be a fad again for a little while. And then it'll get packed away, and maybe every year on the anniversary, the movie JFK will show on some cable channel to keep the memories fresh.
Yeah, exactly. Thank you again so much for your time, Marty.
Thank you for inviting me on the show. It's always my pleasure.
This episode of Based on a True Story was produced by me, Dan Lefebvre. I'd like to thank Marty Morgan once again for coming on the podcast to chat about the true story behind the movie JFK. As he mentioned at the end, Marty has been busy with a lot of projects, like The Unexplained on History Channel with William Shatner, as well as his historical tours. I'll include a link to those in the show notes for this episode where you can see some of his work, including his YouTube channel. And as always, if you're driving or can't get to that right now, you can always find them on the show's home on the web, basedonatruestorypodcast.com/273. Okay, now it's time for the answer to our two truths and a lie game from the beginning of the episode. And as a quick refresher, here are the two truths and one lie. Number one, up and to the left proves there was another shooter. Number two, it was possible for Oswald to have taken 3 shots in 5.6 seconds with a bolt-action rifle. Number 3, the U.S. Congress passed a law because of the movie JFK. Did you catch which one is a lie? We'll do a random order. Let's start in the middle with number 2. It was possible for Oswald to have taken 3 shots in 5.6 seconds with a bolt-action rifle. That is true. Even though the movie makes it out to be implausible for Oswald to shoot 3 well-placed shots in 5.6 seconds with the bolt-action rifle, Marty had a very good, detailed explanation of how it is very possible for that to happen. And as he shared, Marty has even gone to the lengths of doing it himself, even though he's not military trained like Oswald was. That's something you'll find on Marty's YouTube channel I mentioned just a moment ago. And of course, that is also linked in the show notes for this episode as well. Next up, we have number 1. Up and to the left proves there was another shooter. That's the lie. To recap, the up and to the left part of the conspiracy theory is one that we see Kevin Costner's version of Jim Garrison reinforcing in the movie. The basic concept is that because President Kennedy's body went up and to the left after one of the shots, that means there's no way the bullet could have come from the book depository where Lee Harvey Oswald was. So by extension, it must mean there's at least one other shooter involved, so conspiracy, right? However, as Marty explained to us, President Kennedy was wearing his back brace that day, a back brace that he wore because of injuries he sustained as a World War II veteran. And the back brace was why his body reacted to being shot in a way that we might not expect someone to react if they're not wearing a back brace. That means number 3 is also true. The US Congress passed a law because of the movie JFK. As crazy as it sounds, Marty told us that after the movie came out, Congress passed the JFK Act, or more officially known as President John F. Kennedy Assassination Records Collection Act of 1992. And that relates to the way that information is released about presidential assassinations. Not many movies have a law passed because of the impact that it had, but Oliver Stone's JFK did. Thank you so much for spending your time with us today. I really hope you've learned something new and got some value out of today's episode. If you did, you can give some value back and get ad-free versions of the podcast over at basedonatruestorypodcast.com/value. But not all value is monetary. Simply by sharing this episode with someone who you think would enjoy it helps support the podcast too. Until next time, thanks so much for listening, and I'll chat with you again really soon.